The religion of the future will be a cosmic religion. It should transcend personal God and avoid dogma and theology. Can you feel it? A sort of anticipation growing stronger and stronger? Another way of putting it is time is speeding up. We've heard that discussion for a while now. I know many people are feeling it, whether it happens while observing world events or perhaps through personal experiences in their own lives. Something big is happening. You can see signs of it all over the world. Technology is rapidly transforming the way that we live our lives. Information of literally every variety is available to us at the touch of a button. We are seeing huge debates and conversations taking place about all manner of subjects, from equality to major global issues. New cryptocurrencies appear to be on the brink of changing the way that we interface with finances and wealth. And while all the while we keep seeing warnings from scientists about global warming and overpopulation, which if things reach some sort of dangerous climax, it has the potential to catapult us into a different way of life very quickly. And with all of these changes, we are actively in the process of discovering something amazing. We are remembering who we are. This revolutionary discovery is what will transform life on Earth into something completely different, something incredible and beautiful, aligned harmoniously with nature. So many people across the globe are learning about this, and by applying what they've learned to their lives, have come to witness marvelous changes. Some have been so impacted that they've dedicated their lives to sharing what they've learned with the world. Personally, I'm someone who's still exploring it, and I want more people to talk about it with. Mind, body, spirit. This is the sacred trinity behind life on Earth. Without even one of these three, we could not function properly. And yet, in today's world, we really only understand two of the three. We have scientifically mapped the brain and have a fairly comprehensive understanding of the body. We understand so much about each of these. Yet, what do we really know about the spirit, the soul? What is it? Where does it come from? For centuries, religions have been the primary source for answers pertaining to the soul, but they're not concrete. Each religion has its own answers about how things work on the spiritual level. Yet, as we've touched on, with so much information available to us and many ancient discoveries continuing to redefine our history, there are many people now recognizing the common threads between all of these religions and putting the pieces together along with modern science, which is skyrocketing our understanding further and further into an amazing new world of freedom and delight. For a long time, these incredible insights went largely unnoticed by the global community. And while governments and secret services of the world acknowledged them, it wasn't something that really got to the masses. Yet, today, the world is waking up. Today, this information is freely available to all of us, and I'm gonna share it with you. Have you ever had a moment where you knew exactly what someone was going to say 2 or 3 seconds before they even started talking? Do you have a shared connection between a loved one or a pet where you can always tell exactly what the other was feeling or what they're thinking of even when they're not really around? What about that curious feeling like you were being watched, only to turn around to see, yak! Yeah, just like that. We've all had experiences like these, at least a few times, some many more than others. There are even a few people who can tap into this experience quite easily. And while generally they're written off as being crazy, maybe we've been mistaken. Perhaps there's genuine validity to the idea of psychic. In the world of science, what do we really know about consciousness? We don't really know what consciousness is or how it works. This is what is sometimes called the hard problem because there's no obvious explanation for why we should be conscious at all. And it's because of this reason that consciousness studies is one of the most exciting frontier areas of science today. For a long time, scientists believed that thoughts resided purely in the brain, and that was the end of the story. Today, however, we understand a lot more, and there are several individuals and their teams I'd love to give special commendations towards. The first scientist is a man named Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, PhD. This man has compiled a number of powerful and thought-provoking experiments which change the way that we look at and understand our minds. From his work and experiments, he puts forth the idea that the mind is not isolated inside the head at all, but extends out into the world around us as a morphogenetic field. One thing I love about this man is that he used very practical and common experiences that many of us go through on a daily basis and turned them into a wide array of powerful scientific experiments. In one particular experiment, they demonstrated the connection between dogs and humans by monitoring the behavior of the dog when the person was out of the house. And the dogs would repeatedly show behavior of waiting by the door for their human buddy as early as when the person even had the intention to go home, even from long distances away. Skeptics are often quick to respond that the dogs are used to hearing familiar car sounds, or they know generally what time their human comes home at. And so Dr. Sheldrake ran the experiments using unfamiliar cars and random and unusual times for the individuals to go home, which still yielded the same results, having the dogs wait by the door the moment that the person sets the intention to return. Dr. Sheldrake also did a number of experiments which he described as telephone telepathy, in which people would randomly call a participant and the person on the receiving end would have to guess who is calling them out of a list of possible callers. The results of this study showed a rather high level of intuition for most people, who were able to guess who was calling at a rather high rate than you would expect if it was purely random guessing. This experiment was also taken further with the sense of being stared at, where he proved that people were able to intuitively know whether or not they were being watched, with stunning results as well. Using this morphogenetic field theory, we are able to explain how herd animals move together as if they were a single unit. Dr. Sheldrake explains this by suggesting that each animal in the herd acts a bit like they were their own magnet, emitting its own unique signal into the field. But as they all come together, much like magnets, they link together to form a singular, larger field. What Dr. Sheldrake concludes through his publications and presentations is that the cosmos is not a lifeless mechanism that we have essentially believed since the 17th century, but an organic living system which is designed to evolve and grow, just as we experience in our own lives. I think my favorite line of his is that in response to people who suggest this phenomenon is paranormal and whatnot, he simply says, "It's not paranormal, it's normal. It's not supernatural, it's natural." In the comments below, you can find links to Dr. Sheldrake's presentation that he gave at Google in 2008, as well as one to an interview he did in 2016. And there are several wonderful Gaia presentations featuring his work as well that we'd love for you to check out. The next scientist I want to share with you is Dr. Dean Radin, PhD, and his team at the Institute of Noetic Sciences. These amazing people have created a most compelling experiment where they demonstrated that using nothing but meditative thought, you can affect the outcome of an experiment from the other side of the planet in real time. Dr. Radin's talk begins by him describing that almost all of the fathers of quantum mechanics have described that something extra-physical must be involved in the measurement chain of an experiment. And by this, they referred to consciousness, something outside of what we know as material reality. He then goes on to explain that they built a very simple double slit experiment. Most of you are probably familiar with the double slit experiment, but the simple version is that this is an experiment which shoots photons through two slits, making a pattern appear on the receiver past the slit openings. The thing about this experiment that has mystified scientists for years is that if you don't observe the experiment, the photons seem to shoot through both slits and act as a waveform, giving you a unique wave pattern in the results. However, if you actively observe the photons as they're going through the hole, the photons change their function and act more as if they were solid objects and either go through one hole or the other, giving you a pattern on the receiving end simply as two slits, as you might expect if you were shooting a tiny BB gun through the holes. Now, what Dr. Radin and his team did was take this experiment to the next level by taking meditators outside of the room and away from the double slit machine to focus on the experiment taking place and see if they can, using nothing but their thoughts, intentions, and consciousness, affect the outcome of the experiment. The results of this experiment were so phenomenal and conclusive that they received a 5 sigma result, which in science terms essentially means that there is only a 1 in 3.5 million chance that the positive results they received were due to statistical fluctuations over the spectrum of the experiments performed. Because of these tremendous results, the Noetic Sciences team put their experiment on the internet to really put it to the test. And between January 2012 and December of 2014, they received thousands of sessions from around the world. Once again, they received compelling results of an individual's ability to affect the outcome of an experiment irrespective of distance. People did this from across the globe and still affected the experiment's results in real time simply by the power of their meditation. Further, we should mention that these guys were incredibly thorough in their experiments, taking account of a wide array of possibilities that might be affecting the outcome of the experiment. Dr. Radin also presents towards the end of his talk that they are not the only ones who have demonstrated this, and he pulls out a number of past experiments that have been done throughout the last several decades that have come to the same conclusions, but of course didn't receive much respect from the global scientific community. He explains that this is likely because most of science so far is based on a materialistic paradigm, and that if we add consciousness to the base in our model of the universe, as long as we can figure out the bridge between consciousness and physics, we don't have to throw out our old information, but rather just continue to add to it and develop our understanding as we always have done. If you're curious about all of the details, I highly recommend watching the full presentation on YouTube, and we'll include links to this in the comments below. What Dean and his team essentially concluded was that it's not so much that consciousness just collapses the wave function, but rather that consciousness steers the outcome of the experiment. Observational effect is an active experience rather than passive. Further, the role of consciousness in the physical world can be tested. It has been tested many times and in many ways, and the results of these experiments suggest that consciousness is an active participant in reality. Now, these experiments largely have to do with thought, feeling, and intention. But as we discussed earlier, what about the soul? Well, this is very interesting because in a book called The Field by Lynn McTaggart, she shares with us the work of a man named Dr. Fritz Albert Popp, PhD. This man and his researchers have conducted experiments that confirms the existence of biophotons. These particles of light with no mass transmit information within and between cells inside of us. His work shows that DNA in a living cell stores and releases photons, creating biophotonic emissions that may hold the keys to illnesses and health. Over the years, Pop has published 8 books and more than 150 scientific journal articles and studies which address many questions of theoretical physics, biology, complementary medicine, and biophotons. There's some great articles and videos to check out about his work, and we'll post some links to those in the comments below as well. Dr. Pop's work is especially interesting because it describes that at our most fundamental level, we are beings of light. This goes back to a number of ancient spiritual traditions and teachings who explain that we are all created beings of light, whole and complete, but have forgotten who we are. And that by our process of remembering, we can actively increase the amount of light that our DNA is emitting and raise our consciousness to a point that we may experience what is called ascension. The rising into a new way of life and a new world of possibilities opens to us, free of suffering. This is what is described by the card, the Child in Patch Tarot, which fuses the 0 and the 1 together, showing the connection between the masculine and the feminine within us, the harmony between the heart and the mind in perfect balance to create the phi ratio, and speaks to the limitless possibilities that are available to us when we live from this enlightened place. Now, with all of this research out of the way, let's bring things down to a practical level for all of us. Let's say for the sake of discussion that when you think of something, anything, it appears right in front of you. No, not physically, but let's say it appears in a different realm, one that is in and around all of us, the field that the scientists were describing by their experiments. We can call it the field, the astral realm, the thought realm, whatever you like. For the sake of simplicity, in this video, let's call it the field. When you're doing something, you start by thinking about it. Whether you're building a pool in your backyard or making a sandwich, you have to have thought of it first. Even the subconscious thoughts for things like walking and breathing. This shouldn't be anything new to us. We think of things before we do them, even if it's a split second before the action. This is just how we function, and the physical actions we take generally match the thoughts that we've created in our minds. You might say that we move through our thoughts, turning non-physical thoughts into physical actions. When an inventor gets an idea, this idea can quickly move through all of his colleagues and friends, and this is because ideas and thoughts are spreadable. Multiple people can concentrate upon the same idea at once, allowing the ideas to grow and develop further. This isn't anything strange. Think tanks have existed long into our history. In this scenario, don't think of thoughts as separate, but as a whole that everyone is focusing upon at the same time, and maybe even through time itself. Of course, because we can't physically see this realm of thoughts, we have to use functions like speech and body language in order to communicate them. At least for now, this is how we connect and bridge our thoughts together, through communication. Because of this, we add a bit of our own creation to the mix every time we share something, our own spice, if you will, while still working towards the same common goal. A social gathering is another good example of this at work too. People gather together because they share the same thoughts and emotions as the rest of the people there. Even if you're using something that someone else made, which, let's face it, basically every aspect of our lives involves using something that someone else or nature itself produced, you're still creating your own experience for yourself. You manifested that iPad, house, relationship, or whatever into your experiences. With the notion that thoughts connect with other thoughts comes our first big realization. This new understanding of just how intertwined we really are. We are not only connected in the physical realm, but mentally and spiritually as well. Up until recently, humankind has always understood that they were connected only through their physical being. We assumed that the conscious experience and all of the thinking was totally 100% isolated from everyone else. The fact is, we're not. We are so connected with each other, it's almost impossible to believe. But it's true. We have the science to back it up. Now, thoughts being created are just the tip of the iceberg. The real interesting part comes when you look at emotions. Emotions are much more powerful than thoughts in that they have more gravity. Emotions pull on you. They often control your actions and guide you throughout your life. It's not always your thoughts that decide where you sit in a classroom or on a bus, but rather if you like that girl or you think that guy smells. When a couple is together, it's their emotions that keep them tethered. If they're fighting, it's their emotions that break them apart. You watch TV or movies that stimulates and compels you on an emotional level. You hang out with friends because you have emotional bonds with them. And now this applies on a smaller scale too. Do you ever have a morning where you wake up grumpy and stub your toe getting up and just think, this is just gonna be one of those days. And then the entire day following is terrible and just everything goes wrong? What about days where you wake up excited and happy and ready to go? Your whole day is just excellent in all of the right ways. Even if something bad does happen, you're less affected by it because you're in such a great place emotionally. The reason for these different potentials in how your day goes is due to your emotional state. And to that end, if you wake up in the morning and just take a deep breath and say a prayer of gratitude for your life and the dawning of a new day, it will instantaneously align you with a more harmonious day for yourself. Even if something bad does happen, you can experience it as an opportunity for learning and growth rather than something that, sucks, poo, now I'm in a bad mood, grr. You see, it's through our conscious participation in our own lives that transforms us from riding on the waves of other people's joys and sorrows to creating our own waves and living the life we want to have. You can look into society and see how we create our lives actively by the way that people speak and act. Those who are the most successful are those who talk most of success, and the people who speak most of illness have that. Yes, illness is also a creation of ours. If we have a low immune system, it's because of our own low vibration, which is a product of the disharmony both within us and in our environment. It also relates heavily with food, the primary nourishment that we put in our bodies. Food is a massive conversation on its own, and you can learn more about it in our food series, episode 33. We can liken healing with healthy food to healing from mental and emotional struggles. What quality of thoughts are you allowing into your heart and mind? In this way, healing is a simple process of going inside and addressing our own negativity, resolving the traumas, releasing the pent-up emotional energy, and making room for more light to come through. There's one thing that becomes apparent with this new understanding. We create our reality. We may not always be 100% in control of what happens to us. However, we are 100% responsible for what we do with the experiences that we've had. And we are especially responsible for our own healing of the bad experiences too. Throughout history, we have always played the blame game. It's his fault I didn't get the promotion. It's her fault I couldn't go to the game. It's everyone else's fault I'm so depressed. Whatever it is, and this might be the hardest part to truly get, it's you. All of it is within you. Your happiness, your sadness, your fears, and your fortunes. Every single experience of your life on earth was because of you, for you, and within you. Remember, just as you are creating your own individual reality, we are all co-creating our realities together. We are one species, and as a species, we are creating the realities that we are experiencing as a collective. One argument I hear a lot is, well, what about the starving kids in Africa? How are they creating their starving reality? I would respond to that by suggesting that it's a part of the bigger picture, and that if we can see the bigger picture, we can bring love and support to those in need if we have more abundance than them. This applies through all levels. As a family, you create your reality, and your actions will change what the family experiences. Likewise for a community and a city and a country. Because of this, and because we are not in tune with ourselves, it may often seem like we do not have complete control over what we experience. Sometimes we are seemingly forced into scenarios that are outside of our control. This happens as a result of our collective disharmony and lack of connections to ourselves and our environments. When we become more in tune with what's in our hearts, we can feel out certain scenarios and decide if that's a path we want to take. Maybe I won't go into that dark alley. Maybe it feels right to not take that job. Beyond that, even if you do have an experience that you feel is outside of your control, now it's your turn to decide what you do next. You can allow the experience to get the best of you and drain your energy, or you can decide to take it for what it is, experience it, and keep moving forward, keep growing, keep learning. Every dark cloud has a silver lining, and if you're looking for that silver lining, you'll have a much easier time finding it. Many of us have heard of this thing called the law of attraction, which talks about something similar to this. Across the entire world, people have written in to tell of their amazing stories where they really focused on meeting their heart's desire and then received it through some miracle or synchronicity. This is but a small piece in the vast ocean of the internal world that we're talking about, and it is incredibly real, and you can literally change everything in your life by the power that's inside of you. I know this from my own personal experiences, and it's not hard to find others who have too. One continuous argument I hear from people who deny this whole thing is something like, you don't just think things and change everything by sitting on your butt. To which I reply, exactly. You never stop moving. Change your mindset and continue on with your life. Cultivate your emotions, focus your thoughts, and move into them physically. Don't let your emotions control you. Pull your thoughts into the physical realm. What can you do to change things? Honestly, just start by being good to yourself. Fill yourself up with the emotion of gratitude for even the smallest things and let it fill you to overflowing. Don't forget to treat yourself once in a while and try to change your perception of your life from what others think is best for you to what you think is best for you. Take a few minutes to sit down and really ask yourself, what do you really want? Of course, at first a lot of people might think of money, wealth, fame, and luxury. And hey, I'm sure those things can be pretty nice, but will they buy you happiness? I guess that depends on you and what you do with it. I found in my experiences that beyond all of those things, what people really want is to be accepted, appreciated, and loved. By genuinely giving to others, you will in turn receive that back, and the bonds that connect you to everything around you will strengthen so much further. I want to bring up one more thing before we end this video. There was a scientist in Japan a few years back who made an incredible discovery, but one that even today is generally unacknowledged by the global scientific community. Many of us are familiar with the work of Dr. Masaru Emoto and his experiments freezing water into crystals, which would change their form depending on what emotions were meditated upon before freezing. Now, this experiment received a lot of scrutiny and several failed attempts to reproduce it. However, there is another version of it which is equally as moving. Emoto discovered that by putting words on the side of a jar of rice with water in it, and every day casting either love, hate, or unacknowledgement towards the jar, it would dramatically change the way that the rice fermented. This experiment has been performed around the world and is easily replicatable by anyone, even you. And I super encourage anyone who's interested to look up the experiment and give it a try. And for those who have trouble replicating the experiment, we might find more information with Dr. Radden's presentation, who says that there was a very clear difference in the results between practiced meditators and people whose minds tend to wander. Having a strong mental and emotional resonance will affect the outcome of the experiment significantly. If thoughts and feelings can do this to organic matter, just imagine what they can do to us. Well, looks like we're about done for the day. But before I go, I want to leave you with words to be with for anyone looking for direction in their lives right now. You can have, do, or be anything you want. Thanks for listening. See you next time. Today more than ever, the world seems to be in a very disharmonic state. Thanks to modern internet technology, we now have access to all the world's information at our fingertips. And yet, the algorithms behind the mainstream tech we all use only shows us what we're accustomed to seeing, creating social divides the likes of which we've never seen before. If we took an outside perspective on our species though, you might say that we've always been disharmonic. And that's kinda true. In fact, if our esoteric history is to be believed, we've been growing more and more disharmonic for about 13,000 years now. It's in our DNA, and it's something that we're passing through as a species together. There is good news though. We're nearing the end of this paradigm, this karmic cycle of disconnection and suffering, and ideally, we will never be here again. At the moment, we're just not in tune with ourselves, and our collective consciousness is beginning to realize it. The reason for our disconnection from the soul is actually fairly simple. And no, it's not about politics, greed, capitalism, or any of that stuff. In fact, all of those are simply long-term manifestations of the real problem, which lies on a deeper, much more personal level. The true problem actually lies in our old way of thinking, creating tension on every level. Right now, as you're watching this video, all of us are going through something of a shift. We are changing into a completely new state of being with a new way of thinking and a different understanding of our multiphasic holographic reality. If you've been around this channel long enough, or have seen like any meditation or spiritual based movie of the last 10 years, you'll probably know that one of the most central and core themes of many new age disciplines is the 7 chakra system. Whether you've used them as meditation aids or seen them in gift shops, you're probably at least somewhat familiar with the idea. If not, keep watching, or just watch Dr. Strange and see how it turned out for him. When getting started with the new age concept of chakras, first we have to understand the basics of light and color. If you take white light and shine it through a prism, the light will break into a spectrum of 7 colors. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. Aw yeah, Roy G. Biv. You can do this at home with your own prism, or maybe you tried it in science class at school. We familiarly recognize this as the spectrum of the rainbow, or even more familiar, the basic palette in Photoshop. Scientifically though, this whole prism effect and all of the colors it produces are generally called Newtonian colors, and for the most part are the foundation of the visible color spectrum. Now, of course, there are way more than just 7 colors, especially when you get into different wavelengths of the electromagnetic spectrum and perhaps even different dimensions. But let's just, let's stick with these for now. The thing about color is that each one actually has its own vibration. Red has the longest wavelength and the slowest vibrational frequency, and today we generally recognize it as warm and stimulating. Violet has the shortest wavelength and the fastest frequency, and we recognize it as cool and calming. I don't think I have to describe what happens between these 2 colors. It's like a frequency change that gets shorter and faster as you move up the spectrum. This basic knowledge, believe it or not, is very important, but we're gonna have to look at some other things first. So what is a chakra? Well, it's usually believed that the word chakra comes from the Sanskrit word meaning wheel, which is partly true, but not the whole story, and we'll get to that later on. In our modern understanding though, a chakra is a wheel-like vortex spinning in a circular motion within the body. It forms a vacuum in the center that draws in energy on a vibrational level and can draw in anything from color vibration to thoughts and feelings of other people that we come into contact with. So in essence, chakras are energy points or centers that run vertically from the top of your head down your spine, or from the bottom all the way up. Think of them like pools of energy in our body. When left to their natural state, they will flow seamlessly, but life is messy and stuff like emotions, abuse, and bad experiences get in the way. And much like moss or algae, it blocks the creek from flowing. Ah, you caught me, I'm quoting Airbender on that last bit. Now, despite how you look at it, there are 7, 8, or 13 primary chakras, as well as over hundreds of smaller, minor ones that are scattered throughout the body along certain channels known as axiotonal lines. We'll cover the 8 and 13 later on though, so for right now, let's stick with the basic 7. As we understand it, your chakras are kind of like the etheric motor of the soul. Not only do your chakras draw in energy, each and every chakra radiates an energy or vibration and governs over a major organ or gland connected to other body parts that resonate at the same frequency. To have balanced and aligned chakras will make you happier, healthier, and more in tune with yourself. When one chakra center is out of sync, it may eventually affect the organs and glands that it's connected to and cause the chakras neighboring it to also go out of sync, causing a chain reaction and many bodily imbalances. A chakra can become out of balance when it is overactive, underactive, or possibly congested or blocked. This is almost always felt on a mental, emotional, or physical level. The benefits to energizing your chakras and learning about them are primarily for our harmony of mind, body, and spirit. Your mind alone cannot nurture your whole being, nor can a proper food diet solve all of your problems. It is through your chakras that you can learn to balance all aspects of yourself, bringing you into a healthier state of consciousness. As we mentioned earlier, each chakra is connected to an organ or gland, which governs over a section of the body. The order of the chakras is generally thought to go from the bottom up, starting with red and changing vibrations in each chakra until you get to violet. However, we've recently discovered that you can explore them the other way, starting with a higher awareness and bringing it down into your body. This is exactly the methodology behind the 7-day transformation, a one-of-a-kind course that has seen thousands of people change their lives and share their stories about it. And you can learn more about that by clicking the link in the description. It truly is profound. Now, when you break light apart, you get 7 colors. These are the same 7 colors that our physical body is tethered to. What would you see if you were to look at a human being through an etheric energy prism? Are we bodies of light? Think about it. Now, not only does each chakra connect to an organ or gland, but each chakra also has a very specific trait. The first chakra is survival and is connected to the adrenal gland. The next one, the sacral, governs sex or interaction and is connected to the reproductive organs. The third is the solar plexus, power or ego, and connected to the pancreas, and is often cited as being similar to the Sea of Qi mentioned in Taoist alchemical texts like The Secret of the Golden Flower. The fourth is based in love and connects to the thymus and the heart. The fifth, the throat, is expression and connects to the thyroid. The sixth is called the third eye, which is psychic and intuitive and connects to the pituitary gland. And finally, we have the crown chakra, which is the spiritual chakra and connects to the pineal gland. Although this is debated, and some say that the pineal gland is also connected to the third eye and the pituitary gland with the crown. Now, survival, sex, power, love, expression, vision, and spirituality. These are the 7 traits through which we grow and are at the core of our being and relate to our existence on a fundamental level. Understanding this system and being present with it can help us find out where we're in or out of balance. Okay, so after all that, we know a fair bit about what chakras are now, yet we haven't even begun to scratch the surface of this topic. Let's talk about opening, activating, and charging your chakras. Do you know of a time when you were struggling with your ego or didn't seem to have a heart or couldn't express yourself in your usual way? If you or anyone you know has a problem or comes off too strong in any of these traits, the reason why could be because of an imbalance within the chakras. As we know, each chakra resonates to a color. Doing something as simple as wearing clothing that matches the color of a chakra can even cause it to resonate. I remember when I was first learning about this, all of my chakras were closed except for my throat, which was way too open. The reason for this was because my bedroom was painted blue as well as my bed sheets, and every night I would get a chakra boost in that one area. And the reason that something like the color of your room would have an effect on chakras is specifically because everything has a vibration, and our environment stimulate us to think, feel, and take action just as much as our own thoughts do. If you don't believe us, just check out our episode on the biology of belief. And if that's not good enough, just ask Google why they spent millions upon millions of dollars testing what colors would compel people to use their products and services more and spend more money at the same time. Now, sunlight is of course our main source and provider of light, heat, and energy. Sunlight itself consists of energies in the form of cosmic rays, gamma rays, X-rays, visible light rays, infrared rays, microwaves, and even radio waves. I mean, let's be real. The sun is just basically constantly waving at us. Haha, ba-dum-tsh. So straight up, lying in the sun for half an hour can give you a powerful energy boost in addition to all of that delicious vitamin D. Our skin loves that stuff. In fact, the practice of sun gazing during sunset or sunrise, when it's actually safe to do, is an ancient practice that was said to bring numerous benefits and skyrocket your ascension process that is attested to by many ancient yogis. Generally speaking, even something as simple as eating food that matches the chakra colors is just as good as well. Seriously, it's believed that eating red tomatoes and apples are good for the root chakra. Eating greens are good for the heart. Could blueberries and eggplants open your mind? At least blueberries. You open up an eggplant and it's like, psych, solar plexus, fool. Does this make you want to eat healthier? However, you have to consider what's in the food too. Skittles may seem like it's good for your entire chakra body of consciousness, but they probably break every chakra considering what's in them. But on that note, if you want to learn more, check out our movie called Healing with Food. Finally, the best way to open your chakras, hands down, is meditation. There are tons of meditations and chakra cleansings out on the web. In fact, we've made one too, and we'll share it with you soon. Sometimes though, it's as easy as just visualizing the chakra in the area that it's in and seeing it open or flood with energy. Buddhist tradition often talks about seeing the chakras as flowers with closed petals and meditating to see them opening and blooming into their full beauty. And finally, another way that you can work with your chakras is through Reiki. See, Reiki masters are people who are sensitive to and trained to work with energy. They learn to move energy throughout their body and connect it and flow it into yours. It's a very amazing process. You may have to ask, but Reiki masters can also typically communicate with your higher self for you and ask you what you need to progress on your path. Reiki itself is growing more and more popular in the last 15 years, so it shouldn't be very hard to find a number of places near you that offer it as a service. If you're serious about this and you don't know where to start, Reiki and meditation are excellent first steps. However, as with everything, be mindful that we don't want to become reliant on external support just to get by. Reiki can be very helpful, just like a plant medicine ceremony, but not so that you can just go and trash your body the next day saying, oh, no worries, I'm just gonna get Reiki again to realign. If you are getting Reiki, do your best to stay aligned after the session, ideally supplementing your own health with proper food, meditation, and even exercise. Medical science has proven that toxins and impurities, including negative thoughts, chemicals in our food, and other pollutants can influence the body. If these are consistent, then chakra imbalances can manifest, which may eventually affect us on mental and physical levels. Traditional healthcare at this time is unable to naturally or totally alleviate symptoms, especially before they happen. And this means it's up to us to improve our health conditions on our own. We can't forget that we need to take care of our whole being, not just the parts that gain symptoms. And with that, I bid you adieu. But don't worry, because we'll be back again soon for even more chakra remakes in the spirit science journey. If you haven't guessed by now, understanding the chakras is akin to understanding the cosmic universal flow. It's a scaling and harmonizing of vibration between polarized frequencies. Just looking at the waveform alone, the vibration of red and the vibration of blue are undoubtedly completely different, and our chakras are the exact same way. There are two primary ways of communicating with beings of higher consciousness. One is through astral projection, where you leave your physical body and communicate to them in person. As much as I'd love to break into astral travel right now, we have to save that for later. The other method involves having a being come to Earth and communicate through a trained person, and this is called channeling. Channeling is a natural form of communication between humans and beings of higher consciousness, included but not limited to angelic beings, spirits of nature, non-physical entities, or even animals and pets. In a sense, it's basically when a human will turn him or herself into kind of like a phone for beings of higher consciousness and people to communicate. A channeler can choose who or what they want to channel. As long as the other party has an interest in communicating, the link is made and the channeling can begin. Now don't worry, there's no possession or anything harmful taking place here. The body is still under the complete control of the channeler, but the channeler and spirit are communicating through thought. Messages are communicated on levels of emotion and thought rather than spoken word. The channeler will then decipher what the spirit tells him into human language. Contrary to popular belief, entities do not generally use human languages because it is considered awkward and clumsy. The majority of this message is conveyed through an elegant series of sensory feelings. Let's talk about animal communication, because this is a form of channeling that you yourself can do. Channeling pets is one of the easiest forms of this art. Pets, of course, do not use human language, but they have a strong desire to communicate with humans. A small disclaimer, if you're planning on trying this, it's also helpful to charge your third eye chakra, as we talked about in lesson 2. It will assist with your mental connection to them. You'll want to practice on a family pet before taking a leap to anything else. A cat or dog who is familiar with you is the best choice to begin. Cats are a tad more difficult because they tend to pick and choose what they want to listen to. A family dog can be easier as they are pack animals and will be more apt to tune in to the leader of the pack, which is you. So let's go over some of the basic steps to do this. Start by taking your dog into a quiet room. Sit on the floor next to him, or if he's allowed on the couch or bed, have him sit next to you. Pet him in his favorite spot until he's settled in. Then start talking quietly to him in a loving tone. Find one short sentence or word and use it over and over. You could say, hey there sweetie, or okay buddy. Let's just call this your key phrase. When you've gone over your key phrase 10 times or so, close your eyes and be silent. Stop petting him and begin to form a picture in your mind of what you want him to know. You may have to practice visualizations if you haven't ever done this before. After the picture is formed and clear, float the image out of your forehead where your third eye is located and into your dog's head directly between the eyes. Once you've done this, speak the key phrase again one more time and float the image again into his head. Keep doing this until he either leaves to get up or puts his head on your lap. If he leaves, follow him and do it again. If you begin to get a reaction from him, like putting his head in your lap or something else, congratulations, you've just communicated with your dog. Cats are a bit more stubborn, so it'll depend on the cat you're trying to communicate with. The image you're visualizing to him may have to be their favorite cat treat or something that they really like. If they're especially loving snuggle cats, then that's all the better. Use the same directions with the dog though, and who knows, you could be talking with them in no time. If you have smaller animals like avians and reptiles, you have to remember that the animal has a smaller brain. Their reception of pictures is apt to be slower and take longer. Remember, practice and patience is crucial to learning to do this. You'll probably start with minimal results, but if you're persistent, you will not only master the family pet chat, but other animals around you, like your friends' pets or pets in the car barking at you as you walk by and so on. One big question that everyone has around now, well, do they talk back? Yeah, they do. I communicate with my cat Toonie and he always tells me what he wants, whether it's food, water, or to go outside. I've actually read that horses are really good at communication as well. In an article I'll be posting in the comments of this video, a woman said that one time she had a horse specifically ask for a green apple, not a red one. Had to be green. Of course, she immediately got one and gave it to her, and they started communicating more. I know what you're probably thinking. Well, don't I have to be psychic to do this? Well, yes, but everyone is psychic, but most people don't really realize it. There's a gland in the brain called the pineal gland, which scientists have actually labeled the psychic gland. Through charging your third eye chakra, you begin to activate the pineal gland and your psychic connection can begin. Just remember to release the concept that you'll hear words and allow yourself to feel into your animal friend. So now we understand how to channel beings of lower consciousness, animals. For beings of higher consciousness, it's essentially the same thing, only reversed. In this scenario, we are like the animal and we are communicating with beings who know and understand far more than we do. There's actually a being channeled named Cryon of Magnetic Service. He talks a lot about worldly events and what's going on a global scale. What's interesting is that Cryon has been invited to the United Nations 7 times over the last 13 years. If the UN listens to channeling, maybe it deserves a little more credibility than we realize. On my YouTube, I'm going to be posting small snippets from various channels, but most of them from Crimson Circle. Crimson Circle started out in 1999 when a being named Tobias started communicating with Jeffrey Hope. There's actually a really cool story here. I can't go over all of the details, but Tobias was actually written about in the Bible, in the book of Tobit. This particular book was removed by the church in 1546 during the Council of Trent. Tobias was written as one of the main characters in that book, and Jeffrey and him began communicating more. In 1999, Crimson Circle was formed, a group dedicated to communicating with Tobias and other spirits. Up until recently, it was mostly Tobias who was channeled by the Crimson Council. Tobias then said that he wanted to return to Earth and live another lifetime because he missed physical reality and said his goodbyes. Today, Adamus St. Germain is channeled instead, and he's very lively. A little insight on Adamus, he is what you would call an Ascended Master. An Ascended Master is someone who underwent a process of spiritual transformation and moved into higher states of being beyond physical life. This will make way more sense in future lessons. Okay, I want to wrap up by going over a short list of definitions. During the channelings, you may hear some words that you're not familiar with. Amyo is absolute and pure trust in the self, the realization of the I am. Makyo are kind of like lies that you tell yourself, that take you away from the I am, like I'm not good enough or I can't do it yet. Kind of like the opposite of Amyo. Ascension is the process of going from one lifetime to the next while staying in the same physical body. Kaldra, you may hear this one a lot actually. Kaldra is the nickname that Tobias gave to Jeffrey. So if you ever hear Jeffrey say during a channeling, Caldra doesn't want me to say this, but I will anyways. That's Adamus speaking through Jeffrey, about Jeffrey, whose nickname is Caldra. Is that confusing? Shambra is the name that Adamus uses for the group of humans going through the awakening process. If you're watching the videos, you too are a Shambra. Shoud is a channeling, essentially. What you'll be watching are shouds, gatherings for communication with Adamus and other beings. Well, that about wraps this one up. Happy channeling! Know ye not that ye are gods? Better get some popcorn ready. This one's going to be pretty long. What we're going to be talking about today is something that will be very important in the next few lessons. The topic is male and female energy. From there, we'll be talking about left brain and right brain, then the new children, and bring it full circle. Ready? Deep breath. A few weeks ago, we touched upon chakras and how they're at the source of what's affecting your internal systems. What we didn't talk about was the energy flowing within them. Now, there's lots of kinds of energy through and around all of us, and that'll be a future topic later on. Today, I want to talk about two specific energies that can be expressed through this image. The energy that flows here is male and female energy. Male energy is focused, and female energy is creative and random. Neither of them is greater nor weaker than the other, and both can be extremely powerful when fully manifested. Female energy is the land of unbridled possibilities, creative potential, and affecting the universe from within. Focused male energy takes direct roads from point A to point B. This energy can be as strong as a tank, accomplishing tasks and going where it needs to go with precision and without distraction. The important thing to know about this energy isn't how they move. I'm going to use some super basic sacred geometry to demonstrate this. This is the Fibonacci spiral. We're going to be talking a lot more about it when we dive into the topic. For now, all you have to know is that it starts at 1 and flows outward forever in a very specific way and is present in all life everywhere. As male energy flows through the spiral, it goes from base point to point, from here to here, to here to here. It doesn't curve, it just goes straight where it needs to be. Female energy, however, would flow in the actual spiral. It would go around, going in and around outside all of the lines, but still getting to the same or similar results. This is the graphic representation of how it flows, but it also acts in the same way. From this understanding, you can see how we use these energies in our lives. It's the difference between driving straight to work and being on schedule all the time, and taking the scenic route because it's a more pleasant ride, even if it means being late. It's baking a cake strictly by what it says in the cookbook, and putting it together with what just feels right. It's getting that promotion for working the hardest, and getting that promotion for coming up with the best ideas. Here's a relatable example. It's the difference between Inception and Sucker Punch. Both about dreams, but one of them being the masculine story of professional men just doing their no-nonsense work, trying to get the job done, and the other being the feminine story that was creative and random and, according to many, didn't make much sense. Both male and female energy, like the chakras, have their own traits. Male energy is linear, analytical, strategic, and practical. However, when male energy is constricted, it is very blundering and confrontational, and what tends to occur is not seeing all sides of a situation, or not being open to any other possibility other than the one being pursued. You can see a lot of that in today's society. Most commonly, we call it being closed-minded. Female energy, on the other hand, moves in curves. It does not stay inside the lines. It is creativity and movement and expression and emotion. It can do anything and go anywhere, but it has trouble sticking to schedule. If constricted, it can get out of its flow, running rampant between emotions and mood swings and ideas. The creativity could get jumbled and come out as an out-of-control mess. We don't have this widespread issue in today's society, and it has a lot to do with our brain hemispheres. We're gonna look at that in a moment. One big difference between the two is that male energy looks at parts and female energy looks at wholes. Before I go on, I wanna make this clear. Male and female energy has very little to do with sexual orientation. Like, it's in the mix, but it's not a fundamental part of the energy itself. For example, if you look at the shape of male and female bodies, men have straighter bodies, women have curvier bodies. We'll probably come back to this in a lesson down the road. Okay, brain hemispheres. We have 2 of them, and if you remember what you learned in grade 10 biology, this will be familiar. The left brain is the male energy side of the brain. It is orderly, statistical, logical, and mathematical. It sees things in straight lines, rational and practical. The right brain is the female energy side of the brain. It is our creative side, a free spirit. It is passion and experience of taste and feeling, movement and art. As is the same with the energy, the left brain cannot make sense out of the right brain. You cannot put feelings and expressions within boxes. They must be felt to be truly experienced. The right brain too cannot make sense about how the left brain understands things. Okay, so as a species, we are primarily left-brained. Well, incredibly left-brained. This basically means that as a species, we essentially have a male energy imbalance. There is way too much of it. It is dominant and is constricting on the female side of the brain. Now, don't get me wrong, this isn't a bad thing. In fact, it's kind of a blessing in disguise, but we have to talk about some other things first. So, there's nothing wrong with our female energy. We're just not really using it to potential. Our male energy is really messed up, and that's why we're where we are right now. By where we are, I mean the economical, political, financial, religious, nuclear, dolphin and bee killing global war crisis. After lesson 1, I touched upon how right now the world is a mess in a myriad of areas. A few people commented saying, well, study the financial crisis, and study the nuclear crisis, and study the political crisis. They're all completely separate issues. And this is how the male energy looks at parts. We're realizing now that it's constricting on our point of view. As a whole, all of these issues together are further proof that we don't understand how to be harmonious because our male energy is out of sync with each other and the planet. So let's look at indigo children and super psychics. There's a new type of children being born on Earth. Since sometime in the 80s, new children started appearing with different or unusual traits. Their numbers began to increase, and today, nearly 100% of all children born in North America are indigo children. So what are these traits? Let's go over a list developed by Jan Yordi, a play therapist who has been studying and working with indigo children for about 4 years now. As we go over the list, see if any of these sound like you. Maybe strong-willed, independent thinkers who prefer to do their own thing rather than comply with authority figures or parents. Have a wisdom and level of awareness and caring beyond their youthful experience. Traditional parenting and discipline strategies don't appear effective with these children. If you try and force an issue, a power struggle is the typical outcome. Energetically, indigos are vibrating at a much higher frequency, so they can get scrambled by negative energy easier. Emotionally, they can be very reactive and may have problems with anxieties, depression, or temper rages if not energetically balanced. Are creative right brain thinkers, but may struggle to learn in a traditional left brain school system. Often, indigos are diagnosed as having ADD and ADHD since they appear impulsive. This is because their brain can process information faster, and they require movement to help keep them focused. Indigos are very intuitive, often psychic, and may hear, see, or know things that seem unexplainable. Indigos may have more problems with food or environmental sensitivity since their system is more finely tuned. When their needs are not met, these children appear self-centered and demanding, although this is not their true nature. These children have incredible gifts and potential and may be shut down when not properly nurtured and accepted. So what's causing this? Well, for one, there are 2 new DNA blocks being activated within these kids. They are microcephalin and ASPM. Both of these blocks are designed to regulate brain growth, giving the kids a broader spectrum of thinking and a newer way of learning. Because of this, the average IQ of an indigo child is about 140, which is 40 to 50 points higher than the average IQ. We're just learning now that our school system's methods of teaching are becoming outdated. It's because our kids are changing. We're going to look at the broader spectrum of why this is happening in a moment. For now, let's move on to the badassery that is the super psychics. These kids are hardcore. They can do anything, literally. Some can move solid objects through walls with their minds. Some are blind, yet they can see everything around them from a myriad of different screens within their head. There are some who can look at a person and know absolutely everything about a person just from looking at them, including when they'll die. So why haven't we heard about this? You'd think this would be huge in the world. Well, for one, almost all super psychic children are in China, and almost all of the evidence is hardly ever rendered into English, although some of it does make it into the public in China. If you want to learn more about this, the book China's Super Psychics by Paul Dong and Thomas Raphael is a great starting place. Before we wrap up, we totally have to bring this video full circle. What on earth do the new children have to do with male and female energy? Isn't it obvious? Indigo children are directly connected to our species' male energy, and super psychics to our female. As we grow closer and closer to the peak of the shift, the planet itself is beginning to change. Essentially, this is happening to balance us out. On one half of the world, indigo children are being born. On the other half, super psychics. They are here to help the consciousness of the planet in an incredibly crucial time. There are way more indigo children on the planet than super psychics because it's our male energy that needs to understand. It's through the indigo children and their new way of thinking, which is affecting the consciousness of the planet, putting us back onto the harmonious path. As we just learned, to understand things, it takes 2 to tango. You cannot only understand something by reading about it. You need both sides of the brain to click. In the modern world, things like astral projection and channeling aren't really considered science. One of them is exploring different realms outside of the body, and one is communicating with beings of higher consciousness. And yet, because we can only seem to measure it from experience, it doesn't qualify to be legitimate. Because of this left brain constriction, we have lost a major part of what life is about. See, what we have is called polarity consciousness. We see everything in 2 ways, good or bad, hot and cold, right and wrong, religion and science. To once again become harmonious with each other on the planet, we have to learn to understand again from the left brain. When this happens, we can move out of polarity consciousness into unity consciousness, and that's essentially where we're going. That about wraps it up. See you next time. In lesson 4, we talked about male and female understandings. When you watch spirit science, you have 2 choices in how you understand it. You can come from the left brain, take notes, and carefully see the logic in each step. Or you can come from the right brain. Just let go and don't think, feel. Watch it like a movie, expanded, not contracted. Either way, it will work. My advice is to try and see both angles if possible. It is through balance that spiritual health returns. Whichever way you take it in, the fact that you are watching is what matters, and what you receive is what you were meant to receive. Today's lesson will be separated into 3 parts. First, we're going to talk about existence of extraterrestrial life. Then we're going to take a look at human life before recorded history, and finally end with why things are happening on Earth today. Part 1. The Dogon Tribe, Sirius B, and Dolphins. There is an African tribe near Timbuktu called the Dogons, who hold information that would be absolutely impossible to know according to today's standards. See, the Dogons have a cave on their land that stretches back into a mountain, and in this cave are drawings over 700 years old. Now, the brightest star in the sky to us is called Sirius, now called Sirius A. If you look at Orion's belt, following it downwards to your left, you can see it. The information in the Dogon cave specifically showed the star Sirius. They're very specific about the star, and they have a diagram of not just Sirius' rotational pattern, but a small star orbiting it. They say it's very, very old and very small, and made out of the heaviest matter in the universe. They also say that it takes close to 50 years for this small star to rotate Sirius. Astronomers were able to validate the existence of the secondary star, now called Sirius B, in 1862, and only about 30 years ago could they validate the rest of this information. The way that stars work, when they get really old, they have 2 options. They can go supernova, or it can blow up as a red giant, cause an explosion, and slowly collapse into a white dwarf. Sirius B is a white dwarf, which corresponds with what the Dogons say. White dwarfs are the smallest star type, estimated to weigh approximately 1.5 million tons per cubic inch. Black holes aside, that would surely seem to be the heaviest matter in the universe, or at least incredibly close. The Dogons were right on every aspect. Not only that, but when checking the rotational pattern of Sirius B around the larger star Sirius A, they found it to be 50.1 years. Now, this could not be a coincidence at all. It's just too close, too factual. Yet, how did an ancient primitive tribe know such detailed information about a star that could really only be measured in the last 30 years? And that's not all they knew. They also knew about the other planets in their solar system, including Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. They knew exactly what these planets looked like when you approach them from space, let alone from Earth. They knew about red and white blood cells, and had all kinds of physiological information about the human body. All of this from a primitive tribe. Naturally, a team of scientists went to the Dogons and asked how they knew all this. This was probably a mistake to these researchers, because if they accepted that the Dogons really have this information, then by default they must accept how they got it. The Dogons told them that a drawing on the cave wall showed them. The drawings show a flying saucer in its familiar shape coming out of the sky and landing on 3 legs. Then it shows the beings in the ship going into water and coming up to the edge of the water. These beings looked very much like dolphins. In fact, maybe they were dolphins, but we don't really know for certain. Then they started communicating with the Dogons. They described where they came from and gave the Dogon tribe the information. Here's another thing the Dogons knew. This little drawing was on the walls, but the scientists didn't know what the heck it was, until computers calculated the orbits of Sirius A and B. As seen from Earth, this pattern shown in the cave is identical to the pattern of Sirius B moving around Sirius A in a time frame between the years 1912 and 1990. These 2 times are actually kind of important. 1912 was the first year when we began communication with the Greys, and in 1990, a specific electromagnetic grid around the planet was formed. But we'll have to look at that later once we go over some other stuff first. Another thing about this rotation, it's the exact same rotational movement of DNA. Part 2. How old is the Sphinx? This is probably one of the most important discoveries on the planet ever. The first one to really discover this was R.A. Schwaller de Lubitz. He is a famous Egyptian archaeologist who has written many books. He and his stepdaughter, Lucy Lamy, have demonstrated a profound understanding of sacred geometry and Egyptian culture. Now, on the Sphinx, there are wear and cut patterns that are totally different from the patterns on other buildings in Egypt. Toward the back of the Sphinx, there are cuts 12 feet deep into the surface. This pattern appears to be smoothed by water, as opposed to all the other buildings and structures built by Egyptians, which are only textured by sand and wind. The last time that there was water in the Egypt area was over 12,000 years ago, at the end of the last ice age. Scientists have determined that after the ice age, the Sphinx took a heavy beating, after which it was encased in sand for about 8,000 years. The face, however, was above the sand and continued to be weathered. The Egyptians didn't build the Sphinx, they merely restored it. Of course, Egyptologists have been slow to adapt to this new incredible discovery, but I think we know why. See, there are around 5,000 Egyptian archaeologists in the world, and they all pretty much agree with each other in most ways. They make little changes, but not too many, and most agree on the age of the pyramids. All of these archaeologists are Muslim, with a few exceptions, and their holy book is the Quran. Please understand that I'm not trying to discredit a major religion, but as is true for many followers of a single classical belief system, if they start coming up against new discoveries that completely have the potential to change their belief system, or on the surface suggest that there's more to the story than what they see in their holy book, it's usually easier to simply deny what they're seeing. Another thing that's actually incredibly interesting, the Sphinx has a body like this, and a head like this? That's rather unproportional, isn't it? Not only that, but the Sphinx is actually facing a very specific direction. It is an astronomical marker. The Sphinx is in the shape of a lion. If it were built when Egyptologists say it was, that would be only 2,500 years ago, while the constellation of Taurus was in the sky. The only logical time for the Sphinx to be built when it was when the constellation Leo was in the sky, during the 11th millennia BC. The time that matches exactly where our new findings say that it would have been built. In the past, when something new like this was discovered that has a major influence on the viewpoint of the world, it takes about 100 years for it to get to the average person to say, oh yes, that's true. But this time, it's happening a lot quicker because of the internet. Now scientific circles are actually beginning to look at the words of Plato in a new light when he talked about another culture, another continent, from a dim past called Atlantis. The Sphinx is the largest sculpture on the planet. We know it was not done by hairy barbarians, but by a very sophisticated culture. And it was not done by anybody we now know here on Earth. From a scientific point of view, this is the first solid evidence to be accepted about the true age of civilization. There have been lots of other evidence, but it has kept being put under the table. Now we have the accepted evidence that there absolutely had to be someone on Earth who was highly civilized as early as 10,000 years ago. This is just the beginning of how we are going to completely change our view of who we think we are. Part 3. Earth's relations to the cosmos. We are living in accelerated times. Remember in lesson 1 I said time is speeding up? Let's talk more about that. The following is a fact according to Encyclopedia Britannica. From the time of our oldest known civilization, the ancient Sumerians, around 3800 BC, continuing for almost 6,000 years up to about 1900, a certain number of information was collected. Let's say for simplicity's sake, that in that time we learned one bag of facts. 50 years later, from 1900 to 1950, our knowledge doubled. That means it took 6,000 years to get a bag of facts, and in 50 years, we got another one. Amazing! But then in the next 20 years, we doubled it again. And then in 10 years, we doubled that. And now we're getting bags of facts every month, maybe within days, I don't even know. The fact is, things are speeding up monumentally. We're living within a knowledge avalanche. Life on this planet is accelerating faster and faster, obviously culminating in something new and something different. Perhaps just out of the reach of our normal imagination. What does this mean for the world? Why is it happening? Better yet, why is it happening now? Why didn't it happen 1,000 years ago? Or why didn't it wait to happen 100 or 1,000 or 10,000 years from now? It's really important to understand the answer to this question, because if you don't know why this is happening now, then you'll probably not understand what's happening to you in your life or be prepared for the coming changes. Now, the Earth actually has a wobble. Well, it has many wobbles, but the one I'd like to talk about today is the one called the procession of the equinox. Essentially, what this is a rotation that the planet does, which completes a cycle once every 26,000 years. It looks like this and slowly turns on its axis and points to different locations. Science looks at this and says, well, so what? It's just a wobble. But by looking at what the ancient civilizations knew, you see a more complete image. The point actually points to and away from the center of the galaxy. The center of the galaxy is where most of the energy and the most consciousness is. It's not just light up there, you know. So in this diagram is our rotation. Here's the tip pointing towards the center of the galaxy, and here's the farthest pointing away. The ancient Sanskrit writings that also talks about this procession call this going with the galactic wind. The Sanskrit writings say that there are two very important places on this wobble. One is at A and one is at C. Not the very tips as you might think. There are also important places at D and B, but not as important as A and C. According to these ancient writings, as we hit position A, we begin waking up. And as we hit position C, we begin to fall asleep. We continue on the cycle, but every time we make a full rotation, we wake up more and more. It works the exact same way as day and night on Earth. You go through this cycle every day, waking and sleeping, but every day you become a little more conscious. You learn new things, you don't do the same things over and over. I want to talk about religion for a bit, because you can definitely see this wobble over recorded human history. See, when we were the ancient Egyptians, Sumerians, and Mayans and such, we were incredibly wise. We may not have known all of the advanced intricacies of the world that we do now, but we knew about the precession of the equinox, and we had an advanced geometric understanding of the universe that we're going to talk about soon. Then we got dumber and became all philosophical. Not quite knowing anymore, but still able to understand many things. This is where things like the Fibonacci sequence and pi and the golden ratio were discovered. And then we got dumber still, and it was around this time that we had a real solid formation of most of today's religions. But you have to remember that these religions were based on earlier writings. They were written by people who understood far more than they did. They just couldn't make sense of it, and that's why many Bible stories just seem ridiculous. Ultimately though, every religion did spawn from a more conscious understanding, so you can't discredit religions completely. You just have to trace them back a bit further. You'll also see looking back that we went from a more female-oriented understanding to an incredibly male way of looking at things, very strict and orderly. Not much room for creative thought, it has to be 100% logic-oriented. Back to procession. The Tibetans and Hindus also had these time periods called yugas, which were simply ages. Each yuga had a descending and ascending phase. Many of those who follow New Age beliefs will tell you that we're moving into the age of Aquarius, but not many people know what that means. Well, we're right here on the precession of the equinox, just about at point A. Remember, this is a really important time for us, not just humans, but all of Earth, and perhaps maybe our solar system. This is a chart showing the procession scale with our constellations. The astronomical sign that we see in the sky when we hit point A will be that of Aquarius. Are you ready for this, the big finisher? Can you guess when we're going to hit point A exactly? The Mayans figured it out. It all started December 21st, 2012. We're into the era of transformation now. Everything in the universe is geometric, whether it's people, trees, cats, planets, solar systems, stars, you name it. Anything in the universe can be measured on a geometric scale. Having said that, it's important to note that creation is also geometric. What we're going to be looking at today is the pattern of creation. Essentially what this means is that everything in the universe comes out of this single pattern. I'm not making this up. This single image will change everything. When I mentioned in lesson 5 that the ancient Egyptians and even more ancient civilizations knew about a deeper, basic understanding of the universe, this is the flower of life, and it is also the creation pattern of everything in existence. Even non-tangible things, emotions, thoughts, music in its entire spectrum, everything comes from this image. Okay, so there are 13 information systems that comes out of the flower of life. Today, I'm going to show you how physical reality can manifest itself, which is just one of the 13 systems. In future lessons, we will look at more. It's also important to note that at first it may not make sense. I ask that you do not choose immediately to shut this out, and just watch with an open mind, and try and see this in a new way. Also, I want to tell you that by learning about sacred geometry simply by observing, you are absorbing only a very minuscule amount of information. If you really want to learn more, you must begin to draw it yourself. I kid you not, when you do this, you begin to see things in a new way. You begin to understand why things are done in the way that they are done. Promise. The flower of life was known around the world in ancient times. It was found in Ireland, Turkey, Israel, Egypt, China, Greece, Germany, India, and Iceland. It's also been recorded to have been found in England, Tibet, Japan, Sweden, Lapland, the Yucatan, and I think 14 other places. This thing is everywhere. Not only that, but everywhere around the world it has the same name, the flower of life. Now, to understand the flower of life, first we have to talk about how it's formed. This could get incredibly complex, so I'll try and keep it simple. Imagine consciousness, or spirit, floating in a void, which means it's nothingness, and then spirit. No physical body or mind, just spirit, and that's it. Then blackness, essentially nothing, all around the spirit, for infinite. Spirit decides to do something, so it expands its consciousness all around itself as far as it can go without moving. It creates a sphere around itself. This is the first circle in the flower of life. Then, spirit has an awareness of what's around itself in 360 degrees. It moves to the very edge of the sphere anywhere, and repeats what it did the first time. It creates this image, which also creates the Vesica Pisces. Within the Vesica Pisces is a vast and incredible amount of knowledge about width, proportion, depth. Also comes the square roots of 2, 3, and 5, which are all numbers that go on forever. But even more interestingly, comes geometric information about light. We'll talk about that in a moment. Now, spirit has no choice but to do it again. Spirit is flawless, and therefore it will move flawlessly, creating the next circle either here or here, exactly one radius away from the other circle next to it. Every time spirit moves another sphere, more and more knowledge comes out of the image that is created. The first complete image to be formed is this. It has two names, the seed of life, or the Genesis pattern, and for good reason. Now, let's look at the book of Genesis for a second. Each of these movements or creations of circles can be seen as another day. On the first movement, the second sphere, it created knowledge about not only mathematical proportions, but light. The first sentence of Genesis says, "The earth was without form and void, and that the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters." In the very next sentence, God says, "Let there be light." The key here is in the order. The movement happened first, then light happened immediately after. Well, but what about the waters? Well, you have to remember that the Bible has been changed over time a lot. The ancient Egyptians would say that the way our modern Bibles begin creation is impossible, especially if you think about it from a physics point of view. Imagine a dark, infinite space that goes on forever and ever in all directions. You're just floating there with nothing. You can't really fall, but where would you fall to? From a purely physics or mathematical point of view, motion itself, or kinetic energy, is absolutely impossible in a void. You can't even rotate, because motion cannot become real unless there's one other object in the space around you. So the ancient Egyptians would say that before God moved upon the face of the waters, it would first have to create something to move relative to. So, Genesis pattern, after 3 spheres, you get the Holy Trinity. Another interesting one, it says in many Bibles of the world, not just the Christian Bible, that on the 4th day of Genesis, exactly 1/2 of creation was completed. Starting from the first motion, exactly 1/2 of the circles were formed on the 4th day. 5th day of Genesis, 6th circle, more information, and then on the 6th day, a geometric miracle takes place. The last circle forms a complete 6-petaled flower. This is what many earlier Bibles meant when they said, "In the beginning there were 6." Our Bible even said creation was formed in 6 days, and this fits exactly. This is the pattern of Genesis, and so it's called the Genesis pattern. It's also the beginning of the creation of the universe that we live in. These original movements of spirit are really important, but now let's look at something even cooler. Another image that comes out of this pattern is this. It's called the Tree of Life. Many may recognize this as the Jewish or Hebrew Kabbalah, but the Kabbalah did not originate this image, and there is proof. The Tree of Life does not belong to any culture, not even the Egyptians, who carved the Tree of Life on 2 sets of 3 pillars at Karnak Temple, Luxor, over 5,000 years ago. It's outside any race or religion, as with all of these images. They are patterns that are intimately connected with nature. You'll also notice that every circle on the Tree of Life is either the length or width of the Vesica Pisces. The second image beyond Genesis in the Flower of Life is the Egg of Life. This is formed during the second vortex motion. Upon its completion, it creates an image like this, a 3-dimensional shape that you can hold in your hand. If you were to connect their centers, you would see a cube. So what? Who cares? Well, the ancient Egyptians did, because they were concerned with creation, life, and death. They called this cluster of spheres the Egg of Life. You probably won't believe me just yet, but this shape is the morphogenic structure that created your body. Your entire physical existence is dependent on the Egg of Life structure, and everything about you was created from that form. Everything from your eye color to how long your fingers are. This is a whole lesson on its own, so let's move on for now. All around the world, the Flower of Life was always made the exact same way. See, this pattern can clearly go on forever. However, they always stopped after 19 circles. Why? Well, because they didn't want you to see what I'm about to show you. Back then, this image and knowledge was so sacred that they couldn't allow it to become common knowledge. It was appropriate at that time. However, now we either use the information or fall further into darkness. In biology, all cells have a zona pellucida around the edge. These circles around the Flower of Life are the zona pellucida of the Flower of Life. You must remove these, then complete the spheres that were cut off by the zona pellucida. With one more step, you will have the secret. Finish the drawing, add the final missing circles, giving you this. This image is the Fruit of Life. This pattern of 13 circles is one of the holiest, most sacred forms in existence. It's called the fruit because it is the result, the fruit, from which the fabric of the details of the reality were created. Remember when we talked about male and female energy, lesson 4? As you can see, this image is female. It has no straight lines. However, when you combine male lines with these female circles, something amazing happens. What you do is draw a straight line from the very center of every single circle to every other circle in this image. When you do this, you get an image which is known throughout the universe, everywhere, as Metatron's cube. It is one of the most important informational systems in the universe, one of the basic creation patterns in existence. So what is Metatron's cube? Well, anyone who has studied sacred geometry, or even regular geometry for that matter, knows that there are 5 unique shapes in the universe, and that they are crucial to understanding both regular and sacred geometry. They are called the Platonic solids. A Platonic solid has certain characteristics by definition. First of all of its faces are the same size. For example, a cube, the most well-known Platonic solid, has a square on every face, so all of its faces are the same size. Secondly, the edges of the Platonic solids are all the same length. All edges of the cube are the same length. Third, it only has one size of interior angles between the faces. In the case of the cube, this angle is 90 degrees. And fourth, when put inside of a sphere, all of the points will touch the edge of the sphere perfectly. With that definition, there are only 4 shapes besides the cube that fit that description. So what are they? Well, we have the dodecahedron, the tetrahedron, the octahedron, the isosahedron, and the hexahedron. All of these shapes are found within Metatron's cube. This knowledge is also where original alchemy came from. The ancient alchemists and great souls like Pythagoras, father of Greece, considered each shape to have an elemental aspect to them. The tetrahedron was considered fire, the cube was earth, the octahedron was air, the isosahedron was water, and the dodecahedron was ether. Ether, also known as prana, and tachyon energy are all the same thing. They extend anywhere and are accessible at any point in space, time, and dimension. This is the great secret of zero-point technology. The sphere is voidness. These 6 elements are the building blocks of the universe, and they create the qualities of the universe. To summarize, this is the first informational system that comes out of the Fruit of Life through Metatron's cube. In alchemy, they rarely discussed ether. I've read that in the Pythagorean school, if you even uttered the word dodecahedron outside of the school, they would kill you on the spot. That's how sacred this shape was. 200 years later, when Plato was alive, he would discuss it, but only very carefully. This is because the dodecahedron is near the outer edge in your energy field and is the highest form of consciousness. There's quite a bit more here, but I don't think I can go much further on it right now. Anyways, recognize this? The periodic table of elements? Every single element on this table has a geometric relation to one of these 5 shapes. Modern scholars ridiculed this idea until the 1980s, when Professor Robert Moon at the University of Chicago demonstrated that the entire periodic table of elements, literally everything in the physical world, is based on these same 5 forms. In fact, Throughout modern physics, chemistry, and biology, the sacred geometric patterns of creation are being rediscovered. Another example is the egg of life that I showed you earlier. Hopefully that will help you to understand just how incredible and important of a discovery this truly is. Everything that modern science knows about the elements and reality are tied together through the Platonic solids, which come out of Metatron's cube, which is formed out of the fruit of life, which comes from the flower of life, which is made by spirit. Damn. Whether you're convinced yet or not, this is the missing piece of the puzzle. It all comes down to spirit. Don't forget, this is just one of 13 informational systems that created the universe. At the end of lesson 6, I showed you some really cool geometrically perfect crop circles in the flower of life form. Most people didn't like that, or care. So instead, I offer you this. This intense drawing was done by Leonardo da Vinci, proving that he actually studied the flower of life form. In fact, over 200 drawings of his were found, all studying different angles and proportions, complete with descriptions of each one. The editor of the book who published these lost drawings didn't really know what they were, so he just said this is how he came up with his gear inventions. Leonardo was able to invent such intricate inventions and designs because he studied divine proportion. Also, Leonardo was a master mason, and it's clear that he most likely got his original knowledge from them. Is the flower of life, among other things, the secret information that the Masons have been keeping secret for the last 1,000 years? Today, I was going to look at spirals and sequences found all throughout the universe, which is pretty important, but at the last minute I decided to change it because I want to show you something else. Now, in the comments or end credits, depending on where you're watching this, I posted links to a TED Talks video by Garrett Lacey, a particle physicist who tells us of an amazing discovery in the scientific field. I want to show you and talk about his findings, and then we'll look at dimensions after that. Okay, so Garrett has discovered that by examining coral, they found that each coral head has thousands of different polyps. These polyps are constantly budding and branching into genetically identical neighbors. Through performing heat experiments on these polyps, they were able to find that every single polyp is part of a whole, a single unit of being, but each one is experiencing its own reality individually. From their findings with the coral, they were able to look at quantum mechanics. See, the mathematics of quantum mechanics shows us exactly how our universe works, and we see that everything in the reality is just continually branching into new possibilities, just like the coral. As humans, we are individually experiencing only one of these possibilities, much like the individual polyps. What physics is telling us is that everything comes down to geometry and the interactions between elementary particles. Things can happen only when things are perfectly balanced. So Garrett starts showing us some subatomic particles and the things that make up electrons and protons and neutrons. We always consider these to be the smallest particle, but we never think about what's creating them. Garrett demonstrates to us how the particles that create point particles really work. He shows that when you plot them out in how they move, this is what they look like. At the tiniest scales of the universe, in how it works, is very beautiful. Now, look at this. This is one of the ways that these charges branch off from each other. As you can see, it flows in a hexagonal pattern, the same pattern that we found in the expanded flower of life. Then, if you rotate this pattern in 6-dimensional charge space, you see it forms yet another pattern. Many of you will recognize this as the shape of the Star of David, but its true name is the star tetrahedron, which maps perfectly over the fruit of life. This entire pattern created by the particles is mapped across over precise places on a 200-dimensional spherical shape scientists have called E8, of which also has a geometric shape. By rotating that shape as well, you can see how there are nearly infinite possibilities as to how these elementary particles interact with each other. The details of the reality begin to take form. Now, as this shape is rotating in 8 dimensions, you can see a myriad of different patterns here. Look at this one in particular. This looks a lot like Metatron's cube, doesn't it? At the heart of particle physics is pure, beautiful geometry. By now, you probably can begin to see where sacred geometry falls into this. Where do these shapes originate? Do they just come into being at random? Or does the first shape come from somewhere else? In lesson 6, we talked about the flower of life, the original, perfect geometric symmetry that created the universe. This shape, as we learned, is not only the root of all mathematical proportion, light, the Platonic solids, but is also the source of every musical system in the universe, including systems both used and unknown to modern man. It is also the source of energy patterns and, well, everything. It all comes from the flower of life. I believe this is what is at the heart of what's forming every subatomic particle formation, and it probably goes at least a few levels deeper than what Garrett is showing us. Now we can start talking about dimensions. These wheels are some of the oldest symbols known. The only places that they've been found is on the ceilings of certain very old Egyptian tombs. They are always found in sets of 4 or 8, and nobody knows what they are. Even the most famous Egyptologists have no idea, but this is actually proof that the Egyptians not only understood the flower of life, but they lived it. Today, I'm going to show you what these wheels meant, and in future lessons, we will go over the details of this unraveling. There's a lot to cover before we get there though. For the record, the unraveling looks like this. Yeah, it's a doozy. So on the walls with these wheels are drawings of 7 people with animal heads. They're called neaters, and each of them has an orangish red oval above its head. This is called the egg of metamorphosis. The neaters are showing us a time when we go through a certain stage of resurrection, which is a rapid biological change into a different life form. Not the average type of resurrection, I know. As you can see here, they're changing directions 90 degrees, and in doing so, they're changing dimensions. See, the dimensional levels are separated by 90 degrees. Musical notes are separated by 90 degrees. The chakras are also 90 degrees. It's a number that continually appears. Probably at this point we should get a common understanding of what dimensions are, like 3rd dimension, 4th dimension, 5th dimension. What are we talking about here? Most people think of dimension in terms of time and space, the X, Y, and Z axis, with time becoming the 4th dimension. This is not what we are talking about. What we're seeing as the various dimensional levels has more to do with music and harmonics than anything else. A piano has 8 white keys from C to C, which is the familiar octave, and in between there are 5 black keys. Together this creates what is called the chromatic scale, which is 13 notes, well actually 12, with the 13th being the first in the next octave. So from one C to the next is really 13 steps, not 8. This also correlates with the 7, 8, and 13 chakra system I mentioned in lesson 2. Keeping that in mind, I want to show you a sine wave. Sine waves correspond with light and the electromagnetic spectrum and the vibration of sound. We're all very familiar with this. In this entire reality we're in, every single thing is based on sine waves. There are no exceptions to this except for maybe spirit and void. Quantum physics and quantum mechanics looks at everything in the reality of one of 2 ways. You can look at anything, like the computer you're watching this video on, to be made up of tiny particles like atoms. Or you can forget about that idea completely and look at it as a vibration, a waveform, such as electromagnetic fields or even sound. If you look at it as atoms, the laws can be seen to fit that model. But if you look at it as waveforms, the laws can be seen to fit that model. Both of these systems come out of the flower of life, one being the one we just looked at, fruit of life to Metatron's cube and beyond, and the other being this beautiful mess of a picture. Just looking at it hurts my head. Everything in this world is a waveform, or can be seen as sound. All things, your bodies, planets, absolutely everything, are a waveform. If you choose this particular way of looking at reality, and then superimpose that view over the reality of the harmonics of music, we can begin to talk about dimensions. The dimensional levels are nothing but different base rate wavelengths. The only difference between this dimension and any other is the length of its basic waveform. It's just like a radio set. Turn the dial, you pick up a wavelength. It's the same with dimensions. If you were to change the wavelength of your consciousness, and in doing so change all of your body patterns to a wavelength different from this universe, you would literally disappear out of this world and reappear in the one you were tuned in. It's been theorized that the base rate wavelength that we're currently living in is 7.23 centimeters. There's a few reasons for this. In a spiritual sense, the 7.23 wavelength is Om, the Hindu sound of the universe. Maybe that's why Oming is such a powerful tool in meditation. Not only that, but if you were to take 100 people and measure the distance between their eyes, the average length is 7.23. Same with the distance from the tip of our chins to the tip of our noses, and the distance across our palms and between our chakras. This 7.23 length is located throughout our bodies in various ways because we are emerged within this particular dimension. There's another reason as well. Bell Laboratories found this wavelength when they were setting up the microwave system around the United States. They found static in their system because they chose a wavelength just slightly longer than 7.23 for their system. In order to get rid of this static, they did something that we as a planet are still suffering from. They upped the power 50,000 times over what we would normally need, which created a very powerful field, so that the 7.23 wavelength would not interfere. It's for those reasons that I believe 7.23 is the wavelength of our dimension. As you go up in dimensional levels, the wavelength gets shorter and shorter, with higher and higher energy. As you go down in levels, the wavelength gets longer and longer, with lower and lower energy, more and more dense. Just as with a piano, there's a space between the notes, so that when you hit one note, there's a very definite place where the next note is. In this waveform universe we exist in, there's a very definite place where the next dimensional level exists. It's a specific wavelength relative to this one. Most cultures in the cosmos have a basic understanding of this and understand how to change between dimensions. However, because of certain events that happened on Earth 13,000 years ago, we have all forgotten, but we're about to remember. So if we show each note in the chromatic scale as a circle, we have 13 circles. Each circle represents a white or black key, and the shaded circle at the end would be the 13th note that begins the next octave. This circle here represents the 3rd dimension. This is where we are, and this circle next to it would be the 4th. In lesson 3, we talked about channeling, and this is typically where channeled beings are. This is also where you explore when you are astral projecting or lucid dreaming. You'll notice now that the musical system goes upwards and downwards forever, octaves over octaves over octaves. Theoretically, this is how the universe goes too, an infinite spectrum of universes in both directions going upwards and downwards forever. I mean, come on, we thought our universe was big, but everything in our universe, as far as we can see, well, that's just this one dimension. You may have heard people talk about 144 dimensions and how 144 relates to other spiritual subjects. This is because there are 12 notes in an octave and 12 overtones between each note. 12 times 12 equals 144 dimensional levels. To be specific, There are 12 major dimensions and 132 minor dimensions within each octave, though in truth this progression probably goes on forever. The diagram we've been looking at represents one octave. The 13th note repeats, and then there's another octave after that. Looks like I'm about done for the day. I want to show you this. I was watching Ancient Aliens not long ago, and one of the natives who has communication with beings in higher dimensions told the man who was interviewing him
that they have always been here, even right here where we're sitting right now, but you just don't see them. They're in a different frequency.
And no one really got what he meant. So that's kind of a fresh perspective on that. I think, therefore I am not. Only when the mind is silent, I am. After Dimensions, things got a little hectic. There were literally 5 different topics that opened up for me to talk about, and I didn't know which one to cover. Fortunately, I had this one saved on the back burner, so while I figure out which order to do these next ones in, we can talk about meditation. There's quite a bit going on with meditation than most people realize. The average person will tell you that meditation is simply a tool to calm you down, when in fact, that's probably the least important thing it's good for. We're going to talk a lot more about that soon, but first I want to tell you a story about Robert Monroe. Now, if you were to read his biography on Wikipedia, you'll learn that Robert Monroe was a radio broadcasting executive that was researching the effects of sound patterns on the brain and sleep learning. Then he started exploring out-of-body states of consciousness and formed his own company, the Monroe Institute. And that's about all you'll learn. Unfortunately, that's not really what he did. He learned so much more than anyone today will accept. In fact, he found out more about the nature of the universe than any modern scientist could tell you. The stuff that he has written about seeing and doing out of body is incredible. He's completely mapped out a whole nother world. You might think of him as the Marco Polo of the next world. We've explored the lands and the oceans, and now we're exploring the heavens or the dimensions of consciousness. In his book, Ultimate Journey, Robert Monroe goes to great lengths to map out the human mind as observed from a more conscious understanding. This is what he says. As human minds, we are what we think. We are also what others think. Most of this has little to do with our physical bodies when we go below the surface. To deal with this more closely, let us create a model of the human mind as it is and operates in practice. A pragmatic model, if you like. Imagine it structured in layers, like an onion, and let us work from the in to out. At the very core is the core self. This is the original human mind, the sum of our experiences without limitation. The inner core is composed of what we have lived and consciously thought to date. The emotions and dreams we've experienced, whether we remember them or not, the pains and the pleasures, the daydreams, wishes, and hopes. This is our essence, our spirit. It is who we really are. Above that is the animal sub-self. This is the layer that is most difficult to control. This is where the filtering, discoloration, and contamination takes place. The problem is that we think we need to rely on it or else we can't remain physically human. Physiologically, it is the cluster consisting of the mammalian brain and the limbic system. Above that is the conscious mind. This layer can be identified as what you think you are. However, it is entirely different from knowing what you are. The reason for this is that only a part of the inner core is available to the conscious you. Hence, there is much distortion, as expression has to pass through the animal sub-self. The conscious mind may be wholly accurate, but some areas may give an opposite interpretation from that of your core self. Though much of this layer is deliberately hidden from others, a considerable part is expressed in your outer self. Because it is so strong, we have no choice in this. This layer is also complicated by belief systems. For many of us, the complexity becomes a maze. It is no surprise that most of us don't find a clear way out. The next outward layer is the human mind external. This is what we think others think of us. This is a grand mixture because part of it is intuitive, non-verbal communication, which gets confused with what our sensory and analytical perception tells us. This layer is constantly changing with new experience and new perception. It is also controlled heavily by cultural context. We develop these artificial and synthetic drives of motivations, which most often leads to mental and physical dysfunction. Instead of being yourself, you begin to lead a totally reactive existence, which is what many people do. If you allow this lifestyle to take over, it can be a living hell. Moving outward, the next level is the human mind role. This is like the skin, what you want others to think of you. This is fairly simple. It is the presentation of the self. Mostly, it is set by the acceptability and needs of the world around you, superimposed hopefully with waves and pulsing thrusting from your inner core. The presentation of self is careful and usually covered with a sheen of deception. In hard cases, no signs of the inner layers ever even appear, even under great stress. And finally, the outermost layer, much larger than you'd expect, is composed of others' thoughts of you. Consider yourself as existing wherever and whenever another person or being thinks of you, even only occasionally, living almost through memories, but by creating those memories, they are connecting with you and they do exist all around you. It is because of this that most often, others' perceptions of you have very little awareness of what's in your inner core self. The disguise and filtration are in the way. Many people have a hard time connecting with their core self, their spirit. Most don't even know that it exists, though that is changing. So moving on, let's answer the biggest question here. What is the point of meditation? Well, everyone has a different answer to this question. Early research showed that meditation was good for lowering blood pressure, lifting depression, reducing cholesterol, and making physical changes to the brain. These are all incredibly Western views about meditation. There are lots of different types of meditation, but in the traditional Buddhist sense, all of these different forms of meditation all have the same common end result, which was spiritual enlightenment. And through that comes the elimination of suffering. This elimination comes with the understanding of a unity consciousness, which we talked about in lesson 4. Realizing the oneness of all things. See, the traditional intent of meditation is not to eliminate suffering by lowering blood cholesterol or stress, but to eliminate suffering by shifting perspective. Meditation teaches you to turn your attention away from the mundane physical and personal experiences of the world, where problems seem significant, and turn to experience life through a broader, more interconnected perspective, being one with everything. The process transcends and changes our sense of self, so that our problems seem less meaningful and less troubling. The point is not to reduce the physical cause of discomfort through improved health, but to change the importance we place on that discomfort. Maybe it's time to revisit that quote from the beginning. I think, therefore I am not. Only when the mind is silent, I am. When the mind is silent, you can connect fully with the core self, the spirit, going beyond the conscious mind and the animal sub-self, and being in the I am. We haven't really talked about things for you to do since lesson 3, where we went over the steps to animal communication. So now I'm going to teach you a very basic meditation that you yourself can do. Start by wearing some comfortable clothing and either sit or lie down and become relaxed. First, focus on each part of your body individually. First your feet, then your legs, then your thighs, hands, for about 10 to 20 seconds each, and just focus on them becoming relaxed. Once you've done that all the way to the top of your head, begin to count silently in your head from 100 down to 0. Take your time, it's not a race. If any stray thoughts come into your head, simply ignore them and keep counting. Try not to get distracted. Once you've reached 0, restart the count from 30 and count from 30 down to 0 again. After you've done this a second time, sit in the aura of silence that you've just created for yourself. By this time, your mind should be at peace, and you might even have an experience. Don't expect anything though. Just allow whatever happens to happen. Be in the I am. You'll know when you're ready to finish the session. If you're going to take this seriously, I recommend that you practice on a daily basis. 10 minutes a night even, it's all you need, unless you want to do it more. However, the amount and duration is totally up to you. If meditation isn't what you're looking for, don't feel obliged to start. Finally, let's talk about binaural beats. Binaural beats were first developed by Robert Monroe at the Monroe Institute in experiments to induce different states of consciousness and out-of-body experiences. They are essentially audio tracks that place a single tone in each ear, slightly different from the other, which actually creates a third tone in your head. One ear goes, woo, and the other tone goes, woo, and in your head, you hear woo, 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 woo. It's pretty cool. I know what you're thinking. Does it work? Absolutely. Does it work if you don't know how to meditate? Not so much. If a regular Joe decided to try it out while listening to these tones without any meditational background, it probably wouldn't work so well. You have to be good at getting into a deep meditational state before you start using these tones. If you're serious about trying these and experiencing these effects, it's almost crucial that you learn to meditate on your own first. Get really good at it. A final word of advice. If you are really serious about getting into meditation, join a class. When it comes to meditation, personal guidance from a trained and experienced instructor is paramount. It will accelerate your progress tenfold and you will shoot up to a very high level in no time. And that's all I have for today. Happy meditating. You are not a human being with a soul. You are a soul that temporarily inhabits a physical body. Astral projection is probably one of the coolest things you will ever experience. Imagine this scenario. You're lying in your bed, eyes shut, completely relaxed and totally awake. After a few minutes, you feel your body becoming heavy and numb, and then you start rising up, floating a few feet above your bed. You look down and find that your physical body is sleeping peacefully on the bed. You notice that there's a glowing, pulsating bluish-white cord connected to your physical body. You are calm, relaxed, and awake. This is not a new experience for you, and you feel a blissful sensation of peace because you are now unchained from your physical shell. You are experiencing a joyous feeling of exhilaration and freedom from bounds. You look around the room and see that everything seems to sparkle. Everything seems to have life, more vibrant. You fly through the ceiling and into the sky and look down at your house becoming smaller and smaller, and soon you can see the curvature of the earth. You think of a friend of yours who lives across the world in Sweden. By thinking about him, you consciously go to him and you zoom across the world, and soon you're coming down into a house. You see your friend eating cookies at his computer. He's wearing blue jeans and a white t-shirt. Soon, you realize it's time for you to go back, and you think about your sleeping body. You find yourself back over your house, slowly moving down into your bedroom, and then back into your sleeping body. You wake up and go to your computer. Your friend is on Skype, and you tell him what you just saw in your dream. Your friend gapes in amazement. "That's absolutely right," he says. My friends, welcome to the world of astral projection. Astral projection is a phenomenon that is becoming rapidly more popular in the last 20 years, and even more so in the last 5. It is a process by which the human consciousness temporarily leaves the physical body and functions independently, while the physical body remains still and passive throughout. This results in observing the world from a point of view other than that of the physical body, and by means other than those of the physical senses. While astral projecting, however, you retain a very high level of waking consciousness during the experience, and can remember the event in every detail upon returning to the physical body. For many people, this happens randomly while asleep, becoming conscious in the middle of a dream. If you haven't, odds are somebody you know has. This is a very common experience, which is also known as lucid dreaming or out-of-body experience, OBE for short. This may sound crazy, but it really isn't. It's just relatively outside of the average human consciousness. In fact, we all experience this out-of-body state every night when we sleep. Most of these projections are unconscious because we are not trained to remember them. We'll be talking more about that in a bit. Astral travel was also known about in ancient times. The Egyptians called this their light body, Ka. They left inscriptions and drawings on rock walls depicting the soul leaving the human body. The Tibetans called it a double body, which housed the soul. Many Greek philosophers like Plato, Herodotus, and Hermotimus all talked about this as well. It's even written about in the Bible, for example, in the Apocalypse of John, and as well as the epistles of Paul and Tarsus. Reports confirm that at least 1 in 10 people have experienced a conscious OBE, either spontaneous or controlled. Spontaneous OBEs can occur at any time, while sleeping, during sickness, under medication, during an accident, or even while meditating. Controlled is like it sounds, willingly leaving the body. Before we continue, let's talk a little more about dimensions that we established an understanding of in Lesson 7. The dimension I'd like to talk about in specific is the 4th dimension, which is also generally referred to as the astral realm. Those who have visited the astral typically find themselves in an environment where all senses seem greatly magnified. These senses are not our normal physical senses, but inner astral senses. Thoughts can actually be seen to take shape instantly, and anything desired can be manifested by means of the powers of the imagination in the very process of creation. It is the ultimate place for true creation to take place, because you are only limited by yourself in what you can create. The astral plane vibrates at a much higher frequency than the physical plane. There is no gravity, or at least if there is, you're not bound by it. You're existing in these higher dimensions all at once, though less in the higher ones than here. In Lesson 1, we talked about the thought realm. At that time, I couldn't really say 4th dimension. It would have made no sense. But ultimately, that's where your thoughts are manifested. Even right now, as you're watching this, you're manifesting thoughts or ideas into this realm. From my understanding, emotions manifest on the 5th dimension, or it could be the 6th, as they are much more powerful. When you visit the astral realm, you'll learn that it's basically divided into 3 sections. This spans across different dimensional overtones that we covered previously. They're usually just called lower, middle, or higher astral planes. The difference is their vibratory frequency. The lower astral plane is vibrating at a very low frequency. It's relatively dark and more primal. Some have described it as the places of Dante's Inferno, and others think of it as purgatory. Many lost souls reside here, but it's usually also where people go when they're dreaming, as well as where you're exploring when you are astral projecting, unless you know how to raise your own frequencies into higher realms. It takes a long time to get there, though. The middle realm is a plane full of double rainbows of vivid colors and exquisite beauty. It would be impossible to try and rationalize this place. Everything, including inanimate objects, have auras of energy emanating from them. Time is a great illusion to us, and in these realms, time will seem distorted. Many people have said that they are able to perceive past and future events. The higher astral planes are called the heavens by the Christians, and the Summerland by the spiritualists. This place is beyond comprehension for most people, but it is a very pure, angelic realm. In fact, this is where the angels reside. Oh yes, angels are real. Remember when I said you were existing on higher dimensions as well? Well, angels would be a part of your higher self. To this day, all over the world, people report of being visited by angels. This is where they're from. As the dimensional levels go higher and higher, less and less has been documented. For few people have actually been there to write about them, and even those who have a hard time putting such experiences into human words. So, let's talk about some benefits of astral travel. First-hand experience gives us the unique opportunity to experience and explore beyond the limits of our physical senses. It gives us the ability to obtain first-hand knowledge of our existence. recalling past lives. We learn more about ourselves by understanding our past lives. Most people on Earth have been reincarnating over and over for the past 13,000 years since the to-be-discussed fall I mentioned in Lesson 7. As we project more and more, we begin to have healthy recollections of past lives. Identify reasons for existence. You may even recall the purpose that you came to this lifetime on Earth for. This information can help us get to know ourselves better, overcome traumas, self-cure certain illnesses, and expand our sense of fraternity and universalism. Remember, you don't have a purpose except the one you give yourself. Do you remember what that purpose was? Flight. Probably the best part about astral projection. I've only had 4 or 5 out-of-body experiences personally, but in all of them, I just ended up flying around. One time, I even flew through space. In the astral, even the sky isn't the limit. You can glide through the air like a balloon, or Superman around the world at breakneck speeds. I can't stress enough how fun this is. If you're gonna astral project, you'll probably just want to fly all the time. Meeting guides. You can meet up with your non-physical guides. They have had many names throughout history. Your higher self, your guides, your mentors, guardian angels, or simply your helpers. One time I was in meditation and I asked my guides to help me with astral projection, and they told me that they were helping, but I would still have to leave my body consciously on my own. Damn spirit guides. I wanted them to just pull me out. Other benefits also include overall well-being, a reduction in hostility, increased psychic abilities, accelerated personal development, inner calmness, an increased quest for answers, an increased respect and zest for life, meeting deceased loved ones, increased intelligence and memory recall, increased knowledge and wisdom, witnessing other realities, increased self-responsibility, increased spirituality, healing, and the biggest one of all, an understanding of life after death. Through astral projection, individuals are provided with irrefutable personal evidence that we are immortal. The physical body can die, but the consciousness lives forever. It reassures us that there is a life after death. People who have even one OBE are generally transformed, having a much greater faith in existence beyond the physical. Fear of death is just fear of the unknown. Once you separate from your body, you absolutely know that you continue after death. Dying may not be a scary experience, but rather a wondrous, spiritual adventure into the next realm of being. Death is something to be embraced with excitement and anticipation when the time arrives. That's key, by the way. When the time arrives. I'm not advocating you kill yourself, especially at this point in human history. You're going to want to be around for what's happening. On that topic, it's time to talk about heaven and hell. When you astral project, one of the first things you realize is that you are in control of your reality, more instantly than on the physical. If you want to fly, you fly. If you want some kind of flying car, you can materialize it right in front of you. Though I'm not sure why you'd need it. The concept of heaven and hell came from this understanding. When you die, you return to the 4th dimension. If you're a good person, you will create a good reality. Good people create good afterlife in higher dimensions. Then they will hang around in that realm for however long they want, and eventually, if they choose to, return to Earth and start a new lifetime. If you are a bad person, full of hatred or fear or anger, you will also return to this 4th dimension, but you will create a reality full of hatred and fear and anger. Ultimately, heaven and hell are the same place, and it's what you create it to be. For the record, this is how it works in the physical realm as well. We talked about this in Lesson 1. You create your own reality. It's just in this dimension, the process is very slow because everything is more dense. You're bound by your physical body. The silver cord that I mentioned earlier, by the way, is the cord that tethers your physical body to your spirit. It connects when your soul connects to the physical body, and when you are astral projecting, it tethers your spirit to your body and you can see it, but you can't break it. The cord only breaks when you die. Everyone who has ever consciously astral projected will see this cord. It can stretch to infinity and will make sure that no matter how far you go, you can always return to your body. Dreaming! What are dreams? Well, when you're asleep, you are out of body. Your physical body needs rest, but your consciousness, your spirit, does not. So your consciousness returns to higher levels of being for the night. You do this every night. Remember, in higher dimensions, you can create any experience for yourself instantly. Dreams are simply you just creating experiences for yourself out of memories or thoughts or emotions that you have. Usually while you're dreaming, you're functioning at a very low level of consciousness. You're not trained to remember and consciously experience these realities you're creating. So dreams seem kind of hazy. So when you have a dream and you're pondering the meaning, just ask yourself, why did I give myself that experience? Some have said in these higher realms they could perceive the past and future. Perhaps this is why sometimes we have dreams of things that happen a week later. Scientist Stephen LaBerge has actually proven that the phenomena known as lucid dreaming is real. Lucid dreaming and astral projection are actually the exact same thing. Many mainstream scientists will say that astral projection is unproven. However, now we've proven lucid dreaming to be real. So naturally, if you accept lucid dreaming, you have to accept astral projection as well. So what's the difference between lucid dreaming and astral projection? Well, lucid dreaming is becoming conscious while asleep, already out of body. Astral projection is consciously leaving the body, going straight from a waking state to an out-of-body state. And that's it. Now I have a little surprise for you, but first I want to say this. I don't have time to teach you methods of astral projecting, but I have a myriad of resources for you to look at in case you want to try it out. I really recommend it because it's absolutely the coolest experience you will ever have. Even for you skeptics, I ask that you don't immediately shut this out, especially since modern science has proven it to be real. My first recommended source is the book Astral Projection: Amazing Journeys Outside the Body. This is the best book you will ever read on the topic. It has great descriptions and explanations of everything, including tons and tons of projection methods as well. Next, the 3 Robert Monroe books in this order: Far Journey, Ultimate Journey, Journeys Outside the Body. As I mentioned in Lesson 8, Robert Monroe completely mapped out these other worlds, and if you want to learn about them in depth, seriously check these out. And finally, binaural beats. In Lesson 8, we talked about binaural beats and what they are good for. There are many, many binaural beats that you can use to achieve out-of-body states, but you should learn to meditate first, of course. Remember, Google is your friend. Simply Googling astral projection will give you a myriad of other sources that will help you find out as much as you need to know about it. There's tons of stuff out there. And now for your surprise. Simply explaining astral projection won't show you just how incredible of an experience it truly is. I want to show you. So I worked really hard this week, and I hope to give you an idea of what you can expect to experience whenever you go out of body, if you choose to.
Stronger from rooftops, horizons. We're calling to fly further. Just one failed attempt from my big ascent. Well, so I pretend because I'm like a waterfall, yeah. People would love to see me crashing down, but I've come too far to give up. I am invincible. I'm like a waterfall, yeah. People would love to see me crashing down, but I've come too far to give up. I am invincible. Each fall stays temporary. I hurt, but start amending. The fight makes the glory, the story's happy ending. Just one failed attempt from my big ascent. Well, so I pretend because I'm like a waterfall, yeah. People would love to see me crashing down, but I've come too far to give up. I am invincible. I'm like a waterfall, yeah. People would love to see me crashing down, but I've come too far to give up. I am invincible.
Don't believe or disbelieve anything we discuss in spirit science. Simply have your own experience. In Lesson 6, I showed you an intro to sacred geometry, the flower of life. We looked at the Genesis pattern and how it forms the fruit of life, the pattern that all physical matter in existence comes out of. We jumped out of the sacred geometric pool for a few lessons, and today we're going to dive right back in. I've mentioned quite a few times that within the flower of life are found the music and harmonics of everything in existence. Let's find out how that works, shall we? First, I want to show you Phi and Fibonacci. It's important to understand for what we're going to talk about. I'll show you what you need to know to continue, and if you want to learn more in depth about these sequences, I will provide sources in the comments. Phi, also known as the golden ratio, or golden mean, is a very simple relationship. If you had a rod and were going to put a mark on it, only 2 places would mark the Phi ratio, which is here or here. The length of A plus B is equal to the length of C. This ratio is 1.6180339 and continues on forever. If you multiply the length of C with Phi, it will create the exact same image, only bigger. C and D is equal to E. This ratio could then span on forever, going smaller and smaller or bigger and bigger forever. This ratio is infinite. It has no beginning and no end. It is also believed that phi is the mathematical root of all other sequences. See, every mathematical sequence in existence needs a minimum of 3 numbers to figure out the sequence. Phi only needs 2. It is the only one. Similar to how the circle and square are the source of all shape, but we'll get to that later on. The next thing that you need to know is that this ratio is found in all life everywhere. Sort of. By sort of, I mean it's really Fibonacci, but we'll look at that in a moment. Look at your hand. Not only does each finger have its own ratio moving up each finger, which is phi to the next bone, but it oscillates back and forth from the tallest finger to the thumb. You wonder why the human hand is like that? It's based on phi. This relationship is found throughout the body in various ways, moving up the arms and legs, in your face, throughout the entire body. This is a Greek statue that accurately represents this. The Greeks were very precise when they made their art, because they understood phi, Fibonacci, and the importance of these sequences. When the Romans took over Greece, you could see the perfection in statues just completely disappear. I'm not saying the Romans were bad artists, they just didn't measure everything to the same caliber that the Greeks did. Here is the phi ratio in butterflies. You can see this ratio everywhere, from the wing size to the body to the antennas. They're all phi ratios. Here's dragonflies. It's the same story. Phi runs along the entire body, and the relation to the body and the wings. Here it is in frogs. Phi is found throughout the body in relation to the head, to the arms, to the fingers, and so on. Well, what about fish? You'd think they wouldn't be found in fish. Well, here's 3 kinds of fish. Once again, the ratios are consistent. It doesn't just apply to these creatures though. Regardless of what mammal, insect, avian, plant, or living creature of any kind, you will find this ratio one way or another. There's a reason for this, but we'll get to that in a moment. Let me show you the importance we used to place on this golden ratio. In ancient times, we built many structures based on phi because we understood divine proportion. This is the pagoda of Yakushiji Temple in Japan. It's built with these same mathematics, from the doorway to the ball on top of the temple. It is a structural embodiment of the proportions that all life holds. The Parthenon in Greece also has the exact same mathematical structure, but even more. I recommend watching Nova's Secrets of the Parthenon if you wish to learn more about this, because the stuff that they find is really cool. The Great Pyramid in Giza also has these proportions. They're incredibly precise, perfect in every way. You'd think that by building these structures using the logical and mathematical proportions so carefully, that they would hinder the creativity behind these buildings, but they really don't. In fact, the left brain understanding all of this can even enhance creativity if used correctly. It makes me wonder about all of the world-famous buildings of the modern world. Could phi be a large factor in what makes them stand out? Let's move on to our next sequence, which is called Fibonacci. Now, the Fibonacci sequence is life's way of creating the golden mean. Allow me to explain. This sequence is continually made from adding the previous number to the current. 1 and 1 is 2, 2 and 1 is 3, 3 and 2 is 5, 5 and 3 is 8. You can see how it continues. Now, what most people don't know about Fibonacci is that it actually continually strives closer and closer to the phi ratio. By dividing the current number into the last, you can see this happening. 1 into 1 is 1. Well, that's not close at all. 2 into 1 is 2. This time it's over phi, but closer. 3 into 2 is 1.5, which is under, but closer still. 5 into 3 is 1.666. This time it's over, but even closer. Continuing with that, it's 1.6, and then 1.625, 1.615384, 1.619048, and so on. It continually oscillates over and under the phi ratio, never quite making it there, but continuing on closer and closer every time, until eventually you can't even tell the difference. Because phi is an infinite number, this sequence will go on forever. Let's look at some spirals in nature, another way that phi and Fibonacci can manifest. This is a nautilus shell. Many people will say it's phi, but it's really Fibonacci. See how when it's in its earliest form, it's crude, not smooth or anything? One look and you can tell that's not phi. But as it goes out farther and farther, it gets closer and closer to phi. It becomes a nearly perfect phi spiral by the time it's all the way out here. This also happens with sunflowers, pine cones, and many plants in nature. In many cases, such as the pine cones and sunflowers, it flows in a double spiral or more, much like the spiraling arms of a galaxy. From the microcosm to the macrocosm, spirals are always present. So phi is basically source, or spirit, or God, in a mathematical way of thinking. The math of God. Don't forget that this sequence is an intimate part of nature itself. I'm going to call it source. It is the source of all mathematical sequences, and all life in existence grows based on phi. However, phi has no beginning and no end. Life doesn't know how to deal with that. It's like source says, go and replicate this, and life says, we don't know how. Because life doesn't know how to create from something that has no beginning. So it creates the Fibonacci sequence instead, which has a beginning, but starts out crude, very basic, and then continually goes closer and closer to source, becoming more divine every step. It does take steps too, which actually has quite a bit to do with evolution. Let's move on for now though. The only other sequence you need to know for this is binary sequences. This is a sequence like 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. We're just doubling the last number instead of adding it to the previous one. We're all very familiar with this. Binary sequences are found in life as well. For example, mitotic cell divisions are binary. We go from being a single cell being to having over 100 trillion cells in only 46 divisions. Binary sequences are also how computers work, by turning on and off chips. Computing at its core, anyways, is binary. Okay, let's move on to something different for now, but what we just looked at will reveal itself in time. This is how a polar graph usually looks, with 36 radial lines in 10-degree increments representing the 360 degrees. Then, concentric circles are drawn, each with the same distance away as the last, creating 8 equal demarcations as the one before, counting the inside circle as 1. Think about what this represents too. It's a two-dimensional drawing of a three-dimensional sphere, one of the sacred forms, by projecting it onto a flat surface. This is also called a shadow form, and casting shadows is a sacred way to obtain information. Also, a polar graph has both straight, male lines, and circular, female lines, both male and female energies interacting at once. If you plot a golden mean spiral at 0 degrees on the polar graph, it will loop all the way around before hitting 0 again, exactly at the 8th circle. You'll find that this golden mean line crosses 5 specific places as it goes out. These places are where the female circular lines meet the male lines. It crosses at 120 degrees, 190 degrees, 240 degrees, 280 degrees, and then it jumps to 360, or back at 0, depending on how you look at it. What's interesting about this is that it creates both a binary and Fibonacci sequence. Looking at the radial increments from the center, it crosses at 1, 2, 3, 5, and 8. Well, that's Fibonacci, but it also crosses at 2, 4, and 8. Well, that's a binary sequence. We're going to look at the binary sequence in particular though, because what you find is very cool. If you draw lines from the outermost circles on the lines where the binary sequence was formed, you get this image. It is an equilateral triangle. If you continue the spiral outward, it would continue to hit these exact same places and continue to form larger equilateral triangles. Let's divert yet again to look at something very interesting. There was a man named Keith Critchlow who discovered something very important to understanding the geometry of music. First, he drew a straight line through an equilateral triangle, and then he measured from the middle of the center line and drew a straight line up to the top edge and back down to the bottom corner. Then he did the same, but passed through the center line of the top and back down again. He did this yet again on the other side. You can keep doing this on either side as well. By drawing this funny little form, he discovered something of great importance. He writes, continuing in this way, each successive proportion will be the harmonic mean between the previous proportion and the total length, and all of these proportions will be musically significant. 1/2 being the octave, 2/3 being the fifth, 4/5 being the major third, 8/9 being the major tone or step, and 16/17 being the half tone or step. In other words, he discovered the geometries of music, or at least one aspect of them. Then he tried measuring it in a different way, starting at a different point of the center line. At 3/4, he found the measurements were 1/7, 1/4, 2/5, 4/7, 8/11, and 16/19. All of these numbers are musically significant. This is very interesting. It means that the harmonics of music are somehow related to the proportions of the central line moving through a tetrahedron. Back to the polar graph, you can see that this drawing has a much greater value all of a sudden. Not only that, but it becomes even easier to make your measurements thanks to the polar graph itself. You can just draw a straight line through the drawing on the graph, and it will give you the center line. This information has been taken light years beyond what I just showed you though. A research team found that you can draw these lines not only from the center, but from any nodal points inside the upper half of the triangle, and you'll come up with all known harmonics in existence. Basically, this means that anywhere the straight line and curved lines on the polar graph cross from 0 to 120 degrees and start making the pattern, you will come up with all known harmonic systems. Not only the Western keyboard, but the Eastern, and even many unknown systems that have never been used. As I'm not a musician, there's not much more I can show you related to this, but I would love to see what a musician could really do with this knowledge. How far could you take this? Alright, I'm running low on time here, so I'll wrap up with this unraveling. Remember when we talked about spirals in nature? They often travel in twos. Usually this is male and female. So on this polar graph, if you're going to copy nature, you don't just plot one spiral, you have to plot two. When you do that, it gives you this image, which is a star tetrahedron inside of a sphere. We mentioned this in lesson 7, and this image is more commonly known as the Star of David. Do you remember the face on Mars? NASA obviously tells us that it's just a random formation on the surface of the planet. But right next to the face, there are also a few pyramids and other anthropomorphic structures. I know what you're thinking. Why on earth would I bring that up all of a sudden? Well, Richard Hoagland and his colleagues have spent a long time researching and deciphering a message on the surface of the red planet. Want to know what that message was? It was a star tetrahedron inscribed in a sphere. Holy balls, right? There's a link in the comments to a page with all of this information if you want to learn more. It's pretty crazy, and very eye-opening now that we have this information about what this really means. Inside the star tetrahedron, another one fits perfectly. We can continue to put more and more star tetrahedrons inside or outside of the other star tetrahedrons, the same way the golden mean spiral can wrap around the polar graph infinitely big or infinitely small. You'll notice that this smaller tetrahedron also happens to fit perfectly around this sphere. Well, check this out. If you put this same size sphere centered on the point of every single star tetrahedral point, guess what suddenly reveals itself? The fruit of life. It's back. According to the Egyptians, as well as the Ascended Masters, this is one of the holiest, most sacred forms in existence. Of course, we already learned one of its informational systems in Lesson 6, and what you just saw was the second, only in reverse order. What this means is that all of the information of music, harmonics, sound, and spirals come out of this image. Not only that, but light and the dimensional levels work in the same way as harmonics, which we've already discussed in Lesson 2, 7, and 9. Meaning that the geometric information about light and dimensions are also related to this star tetrahedron pattern. So just briefly looking at this image that we looked at in Lesson 7, this is the fourth unraveling of the flower of life. It is an infinite spectrum of never-ending fruits of life within more fruits of life. This is the unraveling of dimensions, so it makes a little more sense now, but I won't have time to show you anything more today. So what you just saw was the second unraveling from the third rotational pattern of Genesis, the geometry at the heart of creation. If we value the pursuit of knowledge, we must be free to follow wherever that search may lead us. The free mind is not a barking dog to be tethered on a 10-foot chain. Back in the late 1700s, early 1800s time period, there was a social movement liberating the modern world from the reign of control that religion and superstition had on the people. Essentially, after our darkest part on the procession of the equinox, we were really beginning to wake up. Started making new inventions that were rapidly changing the world. The industrial era was beginning. Because of this, we began to see that maybe religion as an answer was not in our best interest, and so the movement happened. We turned to science instead to answer our questions about the universe. The only problem with this was that we grouped in many things with superstition that we probably shouldn't have. Things like consciousness, intuition, human connection, paranormal phenomenon. All of it went right out of the door with superstition, when in fact we've proven these things today to be real. So after 200 years of just going with the same idea about what's classified as superstition and what's okay to talk about, mainstream science is still going with the assumption that consciousness is just a part of the brain. They don't know how it works, they don't have a single rational explanation for it, but they keep on believing it. Why? Well, when we tossed superstition out of the door, even talking about it became taboo. It's just not done. Literally, the reason that it's tough talking about this stuff in the mainstream scientific community is because that's just the way science has been for 200 years. They won't have any of it, even though there are scientific institutions that prove that theory wrong. The field of noetics and the works of biologist Rupert Sheldrake and his colleagues have more than proven mass consciousness exists and is definitely not a part of the brain. Now, no disrespect to the scientific community, but that assumption that we're still holding onto has not gotten us anywhere. It's time we begin to question the decisions of our ancestors, because many of the things that we've been led to believe to be true simply is not. I'm not saying blindly accept all of the new stuff that's coming out nowadays, but we should at least put it on the table and be able to discuss it as a global community. An apocalypse is a disclosure of something hidden from the majority of mankind in an era dominated by falsehood and misconception. If you haven't seen Lesson 10 already, you should probably watch that one first. This lesson builds on what we covered last time, the phi ratio in particular. Today, we're going to be looking at another way that humans grow through phi. Instead of looking at phi inside the body, we're going to be looking at phi outside the body, and what it means for us in this pivotal point in human history. One other thing before we get this rolling. I want to give an overview about what sacred geometry really is. Sacred geometry is the geometry of consciousness. It revolves around the idea that all consciousness, including human, is solely based on sacred geometry. Because it is, we can begin to see and understand where we have come from, where we are now, and where we're going. Do you remember the fruit of life? This is the basis of all 13 informational systems that come out of the flower of life, the creation pattern of everything. The first system created the platonic solids, which created structure throughout the universe. The second system was the basis of how vibration, sound, harmonics, music, and matter are all interrelated in all of creation. Today, we will look at the third system. The fruit of life will reveal itself in the process. We'll call this system the circles and squares of human consciousness. It is what the Chinese called circling the square and squaring the circle. Remember when we discussed the platonic solids in Lesson 6? I explained that there are 5 shapes from which all shapes and matter in existence come from and form into. I showed you that all of them will sit perfectly within a sphere, each with every corner touching the sphere perfectly. Well, there's one other shape that can do that. It's a characteristic that only one of the platonic solids have, making it special. It is the cube, which you can put every single platonic solid inside, and an edge or point will touch the inside of the cube perfectly. Through truncating the cube in different ways, you can create all of the other shapes. Because of this characteristic, it essentially means that the cube is like the father of all shapes. It is a male form. And the sphere is the mother of all shapes. It is a female form. All levels of consciousness in the universe are integrated by a single image in sacred geometry. It is the key to space, time, and dimension, as well as consciousness itself. Each level is a geometric image or lens that spirit looks through to see the one reality, resulting in a completely different experience. In the case of humans, this image is the circle and square. This is what Leonardo da Vinci was doing when he drew this drawing, and I'm going to show you what this circle and square combination mean. If you put a circle inside a square perfectly, and then continue to put another circle and square, each with the same diameter, one radius away on all sides, going outwards, you get a drawing that looks like this. You'll notice that with the first circle and square, they fit perfectly within the other. This also happens with the second circle and square. However, then the squares begin penetrating circles. The male form begins interacting with the female form. Why is this important? Well, the circles and squares begin to equate the phi ratio. See, when the circumference of a circle and the perimeter of the square are equal, this equates the phi ratio. So as you can see on this diagram, on the fourth square and the fifth circle, it begins to create the phi ratio. It's close, but not perfect. It's only a 0.6 difference. I'm measuring in radii, by the way. The inner circle has a radius of 1, so it's 2 radii across. The next is 4, and then 6, 8, 10, and so on. Anyways, so the one we just looked at makes a close phi ratio, and then it moves out of sync, staying out of sync for a bit, and then bam! Again, it moves into yet another phi ratio. This time, the difference is only 0.52, even closer to perfection than before. This will continue on forever. If you were to continue this drawing outwards to infinity, each time it would go into sync, drop out of sync for a few circles and squares, but then eventually hit phi again closer than it did the last time. Right now, there are 3 primary levels of consciousness that we are going to be talking about. They are essentially who we were, who we are, and who we will be. We'll call it the first, second, and third, so that it's easy to understand what we're talking about. The ancient Egyptians were very concerned with these 3 levels as well, and much of their culture was based on this information. Each of these levels has their own geometric lens too, which look like this. We'll come back to these soon. This is the first level of consciousness, and this is the third. We are on neither of these 2 phi levels on this circle and square chart. Where we are, the second level of consciousness, is here. We are on the 5th square relative to the 6th circle. For quite a while now, I've been saying that we're at a disharmonic level, and it's something that we're passing through as a species. Now you begin to see the bigger picture of what I meant. The reason it's disharmonic is because it does not equate a phi ratio, not even close. Disharmonic levels are important because they bridge a gap between the divine, pure levels. However, when a species is here, it has to get in and get out as fast as possible, or else they will destroy themselves and everything around them incredibly quickly. You can see this happening all around the world today, because we're at the very end of it, and everything is crashing down on us. We've discussed this all before, notably in the intros of lesson 1 and 2. So the reason that we're on this circle and square combination and not the 6th square relative to some other circle is because of this. If you take the square and rotate it 45 degrees, it actually creates a bridge. It connects us from 2 harmonic levels of being. We're moving from one state of being to the other, this time even closer to source. This is a very exciting time for us. Oh, let me show you this too. This is how the Great Pyramid is set up. This chamber here is called the King's Chamber. If you cut the Great Pyramid horizontally at the King's Chamber, which was the main initiation chamber, and rotate the top half 45 degrees, it makes the exact same image as our level of consciousness. There's a reason for that. The Great Pyramid is the key instrument in allowing humans to reach the 3rd level of consciousness, both as a species and individually. In fact, that's part of the reason why the Great Pyramids were created in the first place. Let's talk more about these levels though. So what Leonardo was drawing was actually the first level of consciousness. See how he hid lines in this drawing? If you complete this grid, it creates an 8x8 grid. This is the same 64 square grid found on the first level. Measuring in radii, this grid is 8x8. However, the circle has 10 radii across, so we'll call this first level an 8x10. This is where we were. According to Thoth, an Ascended Master who has provided much of this information with us, the first level is the first time self-aware consciousness began. The second level has 10 squares across the large square, and a 12 radii circle, so we'll call it a 10x12. This is where we are now. This level is the 3rd level, which is also called Christ consciousness. It is a 14x18. Now, there's always a reason for everything in sacred geometry. Nothing, absolutely nothing, happens without a reason. Everything is connected. Out of the whole spectrum of possibilities, why did self-aware human consciousness begin when the 4th square went into harmony with the 5th circle? Well, let's overlay the fruit of life over our first level for a second. Look at that! It exactly fits the 4th square and 5th circle perfectly. Do you see the perfection of life? The fruit of life pattern was hidden beneath this pattern all along. They're precisely superimposed over the other. In a right brain way, this is how to explain why consciousness first became self-aware between the 4th square and 5th circle. This sacred image was part of the pattern. The fruit of life was completed at the precise moment that the phi ratio first appeared, and when phi appeared, consciousness had a way to manifest in a new way. Throughout time, many scholars have tried to figure out the secret meaning behind what Leonardo meant with the Vitruvian Man drawing. He was showing us human consciousness. This is where we were, the first level. There is a man who did draw our level though. Da Vinci was studying the works of a man named Vitruvius, who lived 1400 years before Da Vinci, hence the name Vitruvian Man. Vitruvius actually drew his own drawing of consciousness as well, and this is what it looked like. The circle and squares in this one are hidden, less obvious than the Da Vinci drawing. Regardless, they're there, and this is the current circle and square combination around our bodies. This drawing also contains the exact proportions of the Merkaba, which is an important energy system outside of the body, similar to how chakras are an energy system inside the body. This image also contains the diamond that perfectly contains the man from head to feet. This is the same image we saw in the consciousness chart, as well as the Great Pyramid. Further proof that this was what Vitruvius was demonstrating to us when he created this image. So here we have drawings of the first 2 levels of consciousness. From what I know, there is no drawing of a third. If there is, it's sealed up, locked away somewhere, and is probably one of the most sacred drawings in existence. Alright, I know talking about geometry all the time can be a little daunting. So many circles and ratios and everything. If this is something you want to learn more about, I am providing the Flower of Life books and PDFs in the comments. This information is found at the very beginning of Volume 2, and much, much more. I could probably do 4 or 5 lessons about the geometries of the human body and still not run out of things to talk about. But it's there for you if you want to learn more now. For the last portion of today's lesson, we're going to talk about some recent findings in modern science. As we just saw in the geometry, we are currently in a disharmonic state of being, but we are just about done with it. In doing so, we are moving into a new state of being. We are transferring from the 2nd level of consciousness to the 3rd, also called Christ consciousness. If we look at evolution in Earth's history, we always seem to make random jumps. There are always missing links in the evolutionary chain. Scientists say that we just haven't found all the fossils, and creationists say that God did it, and therefore it's part of some divine plan. But looking at what we just learned about consciousness, does it not make sense that evolution and creationism are just 2 sides of the same coin? Consciousness moves through different states of being, constantly moving closer and closer to divinity, to phi. Every time it reaches a new stage, it makes a rapid biological change into something new, like what we're doing now. This is what the ancient Egyptians called resurrection, which we mentioned in lesson 7. So, if we're really going through an evolution of consciousness, what's happening inside of us? Surely, this would mean that there are also biological changes happening to us at our core level, right? Does modern science see any big changes that they're afraid to tell the general public because they think it will cause a panic? Short answer, yes. Long answer, we are changing. Right now, as you're watching this, your DNA is mutating. See, in the last few months, modern medicine has finally accepted publicly that a child was born with 3 DNA strands rather than 2. In a simplified way of seeing it, we are adding an entirely new strand to our DNA, going from a double helix to a triple helix. This wasn't discovered recently though. In fact, scientists have been studying this for almost 10 to 20 years now. Several years ago in New Mexico, there was a convention of geneticists from all over the world with the main topic of discussion being DNA mutations. Scientists acknowledge that we are changing, but the end result, they do not know. Through sacred geometry, we begin to actually see where we could be going. With 12 strands activated, you have 10 times as much information available to you than you do with just 2 strands, as we do now. Not only that, but the 12 strands work in sync with the 12 chakras, providing an immense amount of energy into the body. We are about to become super beings, enabling us to understand and do things that currently seem paranormal, bizarre, or downright impossible. From the article, The Bigger Picture by Suzanne Thorpe Clarke, we are being changed physically from carbon-based beings to crystalline-based beings. This is interesting because I've actually heard this from various channelings now, ascension and transformation into crystalline at our core. First the psychics were telling us this, and now we have science backing it up. What we know for sure is that we are going through a shift. Today, I want to close with this. In almost every ancient text and Bible, it speaks about a great shift and awakening. The Bible speaks about the coming of Christ. This is interesting actually, because Christ is the name of the 3rd level of consciousness. I didn't just make that up. We are moving into Christ consciousness, which means not that Jesus is going to show up with a big "Ay," but we are actually moving into the level of conscious understanding that Jesus had. It is the coming of Christ through the human species. Over the last few thousand years, we have warped our own history. Our stories of the past have been changed, altered, mistranslated, and completely been misunderstood as we rounded the curve on the procession of the equinox. Modern views of our history account for many things, but completely dismiss many very important pieces in the puzzle. For example, the pyramids of Giza. There is no modern theory that accounts for how these could have been made. Individually, each block cannot be pulled even with 50 men pulling it, let alone drag it for hundreds of miles and then stack them on top of each other 450 feet in the air, in such a precise way that even modern technology can't achieve. Not to mention having it lined up precisely with both Orion's belt, a golden mean, and Fibonacci spiral, and be a primary nodal point of every sacred site on the planet. And that's just one example. Our history is not what we think. Many things that we've been led to believe to be true simply is not. This has got to be the biggest. The field of archaeology recently saw some monumental discoveries that are rocking the foundation of what we think we know about ourselves. Many ancient cities such as Babylon, Erech, and Akkad that were written about in the Bible and other ancient texts were always thought to be myths because no one could prove they existed. Then, one of them was found. This led to finding another, and then another. Inside one of these cities, archaeologists found thousands of cylindrical clay tablets hidden deep within the earth under this ancient city. The tablets were completely covered in text written in cuneiform and tell an ancient story that spans back over hundreds of thousands of years on this planet, describing the history of the earth and the origins of the human race in great detail. Now, the first thing we all want to do is just say that they were making things up. They didn't know the history of Earth, and they were simply creating tales to explain where they came from. However, if this was true, how can we explain how they knew so many things about the universe that would seem impossible to know? Not only did the Dogons know all about the distant planets in the solar system, but so did the Sumerians. They described them all in great detail in these Sumerian records. They also knew about the procession of the equinox. That's a tough one for a historian to understand, because it takes over 2,000 years of continuous observation to actually learn that the Earth has a wobble. The Sumerians had this information from day one of their civilization. A man named Zacharias Sitchin spent a long time transcribing these texts and had put them all together in his books, but many others have also done the same, and the interpretations are always very similar. Not only that, but Thoth has also shared information about this with us, and his account matches the Sumerian records. Adamus and other channelings discuss it as well. If you see all of these records and sources, there is a huge connection between the stories. Now, this story spans back hundreds of thousands of years into our past. It talks about Tiamat and Nibiru, the Nephilim, seeding the human race, Adam and Eve, and the children of Lemuria. This portion of the story is really interesting, but not the most crucial to know. We're not going to be covering this at this time. We are, however, going to be picking up the story at the end of Lemuria and discussing the events of Atlantis up to present day. What I'm going to tell you is a mix of what these records say, along with what Thoth has told us for some finer details. Please have your own experience while watching this. I'm not going to tell you that this is fact. I am simply saying, decide for yourself. There was a time, long ago, when humans existed at a very high level of consciousness. We were interdimensional and were very psychic. We communicated through thought and emotion, much like how animals do rather than speaking or writing, which would seem very primitive. We lived primarily on a large string of islands called Lemuria, but there was a consciousness shift. We moved up in consciousness and the islands of Lemuria sank beneath the oceans. At the time of this shift, a new continent rose out of the waters. We called it Atlantis. Back in the early 1900s, the spiritual path of the United States was similar to what's happening today. People began to learn about meditation and study ancient lands like Atlantis and Lemuria. We actually found quite a bit of evidence that Lemuria existed, and it had to do with coral. See, the ocean floor does rise and fall. Coral can exist up to 150 feet under the surface of the water. In 1910, the surface of the ocean was probably higher because they were able to see coral rings heading away from Easter Islands for a great distance. These rings were estimated to be found at 1,800 feet, which means that for them to have existed, they would have had to be much higher and sunk slowly. Probably more important, they also found the exact same fauna and flora from the Hawaiian Islands all the way to the Easter Islands. This is a great distance, but if you look at a map, you'll see a long string. That string, according to Thoth, used to run along the western shores of Lemuria. It is only on these islands that have the same flora and fauna. Same trees, bugs, bacteria, everything. Science can only explain this if there were closer land bridges between these islands at one point. Although we were studying this at that time, World War I began soon after, and we lost interest in spirituality and the ancient lands for a very long time. After the sinking of Lemuria and the rising of Atlantis, at first the human race became scattered. We moved to various islands and continents all over the world because we didn't have a home. Yet, we didn't know where to go. At that time, there were about 1,000 humans at a very high consciousness, more than all of the rest. They were called the Nakals. Today, we know them as Ascended Masters. The Nakals began preparing Atlantis to be our new home. They projected their energies across the surface of the continent in the form of the Tree of Life, not with 10 circles, but with 12, an extra on top on the island of Udal, and an extra on the bottom in the water. There were 10 components on the mainland, and even though it extended over hundreds of miles on the surface, it was projected to the accuracy of a single atom. We chose to move to Atlantis because of the Kundalini. In humans, the Kundalini is often referred to as the energy serpent that runs up and down your spine. When activated, it provides an immense amount of energy through all of the chakras. The Earth itself also has a Kundalini because the Earth is alive, like an organism, running from the center of the planet to a specific place on the surface. Wherever the Kundalini resides, the people there become the spiritual leaders of the world. The Earth chose Atlantis to be the new energetic center of the planet. After Atlantis, the Kundalini moved to the mountains of Tibet, which is why the Buddhists were the leaders in pure spirituality for the last 13,000 years. It was a very pure place. It moved again within the last 10 years, but that's a story for another time. If you want to read more, check out the book The Serpent of Light by Drunvalo Melchizedek. Suddenly, in a single day, the Nakals breathed life into the Tree of Life on the surface of Atlantis. This created vortexes of energy rotating out of each and every circle. Once the vortexes were established, the children of Lemuria began to be called forth. Millions upon millions of Lemurians who had settled all across the planet began to be pulled toward Atlantis. A great migration began. However, the Lemurian body of consciousness had only reached the age of 12 as a planetary consciousness. Because we were right-brained, we were a female species, like a 12-year-old girl. And some of our centers weren't working yet. They had worked with these energies, but only mastered 8 of the 10. Each migrating Lemurian was attracted to one of these 8 centers on Atlantis, depending on the nature of the individual. There, they settled and began to build cities. That left 2 vortexes with nobody using them, not a single person. These 2 vortexes were pulling life toward them, and in life, you can't have an empty place. Life will find a way to fill it. Similar to if you were driving along a freeway, following another car, and you drop too far behind, someone will fill the place. That's exactly what happened on Atlantis. Though the Lemurians had only filled 8 of the vortex areas, Mayan records state clearly that there were 10 cities in Atlantis when it fell. You can see these records in the Troano document, which is now located in the British Museum. This document is estimated to be 3,500 years old, and it describes in detail the sinking of Atlantis. To fill these 2 empty vortexes, according to Thoth, 2 extraterrestrial races stepped in. Not 1, but 2 completely different races. The first race were the Hebrews, coming from our future. Thoth says that they came from off-planet, but we don't know where exactly. The Hebrews were kind of like a kid who went through 5th grade and didn't make it, so they had to do that grade over again. They learned all the math, the left brain stuff, but they didn't get the right brain aspect of evolving consciousness, the doing. They didn't graduate to the next level of evolution, so they had to do it again. They knew a lot of things that we didn't know yet and brought many concepts and ideas to us that we weren't aware of yet. Now, if this is true, this would explain quite a few things about the Hebrew people in general. They seem to have many sacred geometries hidden within their culture. It also puts perspective on the story of Exodus. Perhaps Moses incarnated into that lifetime to free the Hebrews because they were not direct descendants of humans and were being treated unfairly. Or could it be that Moses was visited by an ascended master of the Hebrews who guided him to free their people? Given what we know about dimensions and consciousness, it definitely puts a fresh perspective on old stories that didn't make much sense. We could talk about this more, but let's continue for now. There were no problems caused by the Hebrews coming to Atlantis. They actually benefited our evolution. The other race that stepped in caused big problems. These beings came from the nearby planet of Mars. See, according to Thoth, Mars looked very much like Earth a little less than 1 million years ago. It was beautiful. It had oceans and water and trees that were just fantastic. But something happened to them, and it has to do with something called the Lucifer experiment. From the very beginning of creation, everything is simply an experiment. Creation itself was just consciousness creating and inhabiting itself in that creation. There is no divine plan. Spirit can do whatever it wants. Having said that, if spirit decides to cut itself off from the rest of consciousness and create a separate reality on its own, it can do that too. This is called the Lucifer experiment. Because spirit is God, it can do this. There is nothing wrong with that. We've kind of been led to believe that Lucifer is evil and the devil. This just isn't true. Lucifer is just another means of perceiving the reality. It is not a unity perception of oneness, but rather a duality perception of two-ness. There's a flower of life pattern for Lucifer as well, but that's a big topic for another time. Anytime the Lucifer experiment has been attempted in the universe, it always ends in failure. The species will cut itself off from love and will become incredibly male, left-brained. What always ends up happening is that everyone becomes very greedy. There is no compassion for one another, and everyone ends up fighting until they end up killing themselves. More than 1 million years ago, the beings on Mars joined the Lucifer experiment, and it failed dramatically. Basically, they cut themselves off from the unity of the universe and created a separate reality. When the Martians severed the love bond, they became pure male, logical beings with no emotions. What happened on Mars was that they ended up fighting. Mars became a battleground. Eventually, it became clear that Mars was not going to survive. They blew their atmosphere away and destroyed the surface of the planet. Nova recently did an episode on planetary magnetics, and they found some interesting things about Mars. The planet didn't have a magnetic system, however the surface was magnetized, implying that at one point it did, but that something happened. Now, we've been discussing the star tetrahedron before, and now I want to give you a brief understanding of the Merkaba. The Merkaba was known in ancient times as the Chariot of Ascension. It is the star tetrahedral energy field around the body. All around the world, there are references to this in ancient texts. When activated to its full potential, the Merkaba, which is both a tool and part of your being, can be used to do the impossible, included but not limited to changing dimensions and traveling through the universe. Before Mars was destroyed, they built huge tetrahedral pyramids. They built 3, 4, and 5-sided pyramids, eventually building a complex that was able to build a synthetic Merkaba. After 1 million years or so, it's been eroded, but the proof is there. Now, because the Martians were severed from the Unity consciousness, they couldn't create a living Merkaba. They simply used it as a tool. They created a synthetic Merkaba to travel in time and find a new home. A small group of Martians tried to get away from Mars before it was destroyed, and that place they found was Earth. About 65,000 years in our past. They saw this little vortex sitting there, just pulling in life with no one in it. They didn't ask permission. Being part of the Lucifer experiment, they just said, all right, let's do it. And they stepped onto that vortex, and in doing so, they joined and changed our evolutionary path. Thoth's father, Thome, was one of the Nakals who set up Atlantis on the island of Udal. That island, the top of the Tree of Life, was the brain of Atlantis, and on it was a small city called Poseidon. This city is what Plato was discussing when he said that Poseidon bore 10 children, the 10 circles on the Tree of Life. Poseidon was made of 3 rings painted in black, red, and white stones, and it was the symbol for Atlantis. The inner circle represented the Nakals, the middle circle were the priesthood, called the Maya, and the outer circle represented the regular people of Atlantis. We'll come back to this down the road. There were only a few thousand Martians who came to Earth through the synthetic Merkaba. The first thing they did when they arrived in Atlantis was try to take over the continent. They tried to declare war and invade. However, they were vulnerable due to their small numbers, compared to the millions of Atlanteans, and we finally subdued them. We were able to stop them from conquering us, but we could not send them back. When this happened on our evolutionary path, we now had the planetary consciousness of a 14-year-old girl. The Martians were an incredibly male species, and also very old. So what you had was a 14-year-old girl being taken over by a 60 or 70-year-old man. We had no choice in the matter. The Martians just stepped in and said, like it or not, we're here. They didn't care what we thought or felt about it. Really, it was no different from what the settlers of North America did to the Native Americans. Once the initial conflict was over, it was agreed that the Martians would try and understand this female thing they lacked. This emotional feeling, which they had none of at all. Things more or less settled for a while, but the Martians slowly began to implement their left-brain technologies, which the Atlanteans knew nothing about. One after the other, the Martians kept putting out these left-brain inventions, until the Atlanteans slowly began to see things through their left brain. We slowly began to become a male species. The Martians gained control, bit by bit, until eventually they had all of the power, as was their intention. The animosity between Atlanteans and the Martians never subsided, not even till the end of Atlantis. They hated each other. The Atlanteans were shoved down and treated like inferiors. It was like a marriage that the female component didn't like, but the male component didn't really care if she liked it or not. It remained this way for a very long time, until about 26,000 years ago, when the next phase slowly began. Before we continue, we have to talk about polar shifts. See, in the 1930s, Edgar Cayce was channeling information for a geologist when he stopped and he said, "There's something you should know. In the near future, the Earth's poles are going to shift." Cayce was a brilliant man with a very strong connection to higher dimensions, where he communicated with other beings for the human race. Ultimately, it was because of his channelings that the belief system called New Age was created. This is again just putting what he was doing into boxes of understanding, because no one else understood what he was doing at that time. Nevertheless, when Cayce talked, people listened. Geologists began exploring the possibility of a polar shift, and they found something remarkable. A string of major pieces of evidence came forth and lent tremendous weight to what Cayce was saying, and they have now changed the world's view on the subject. Scientists believed that if there was going to be a physical pole shift, there would also be a change in the magnetic poles. Through studying lava beds, geologists were able to see where the planetary magnetics were when the lava beds hardened at certain depths. They found that the earlier magnetic poles were not where they were now, but in Hawaii. The last shift that took place was 13,000 years ago, and we will get there in the story soon. They did another test and found that it had shifted again 26,000 years ago as well. Scientists also learned that polar shifts happen very quickly. In a single day, the magnetics would do a complete flip, or turn 90 degrees. There's that number again. And within 24 hours, the sun would be rising differently than it did the previous day. This shift has happened hundreds of times over the last 100 million years on Earth, but it's speeding up now and happening faster and faster. Now only 13,000 years between each shift. A whole new viewpoint is beginning to be understood. From space, would this not appear as a pulse? Now, there's a lot more to talk about with polar shifts, but I'm going to give you the basics. A scientist named Charles Hapgood was studying this at great detail because the leading theory behind what caused polar shifts was still underdeveloped at the time. He came up with a theory that demonstrated to be possible through various experiments. Through these experiments, they learned that the surface of the Earth, the crust, could slip over the main mass of the Earth, which continues its rotation as if nothing happened. The crust would rotate and spin out of control until eventually it settles again in a new location aligned with the new magnetics. During this time, there are massive earthquakes and tsunamis and devastations that rock the world. Doesn't that sound a bit like the destruction described in the Book of Revelations? Now, I don't want to freak anyone out. Besides Edgar Cayce's account, many other ancient prophecies, including Nostradamus and Mayan prophecies, have talked about polar shifts in one way or another. And modern science is becoming increasingly aware that there is going to be a polar shift in our near future, which is lining up with our consciousness shift, though they don't take that aspect into account. It's funny actually, a while back, NOVA did 2 reports on polar shifts, and both times NASA shut them down. Then recently, NOVA released a new video called Earth's Magnetic Storm. That video shows all of the evidence for pole shifts without actually using the words pole shift. It's almost as if a specific company doesn't want us knowing about this and the evidence that's been brought forth. Polar shifts are directly related to the magnetics of the planet as well. Planetary magnetics are supposed to look like this, but the reality is much different. Our magnetics have been weakening over the last 500 years or so, and today, they look a little more like this. It was the magnetics becoming more and more warped that's causing many of the problems we've seen in the last 20 years. Birds follow the magnetics of the planet to migrate, and they'd be ending up in places they shouldn't be. Whales were continually beaching themselves in the 90s because they followed these magnetics, which led them to land where there should have been water. As for humans, you know how on the night of the full moon there are more rapes, murders, and violent crimes than any other night of the lunar cycle? Well, the moon affects the magnetics of the Earth, slightly. But the magnetics are so warped right now, it's affecting how we think and act as a planet. Our collapse of social structure is related to the geomagnetics of the Earth. Or perhaps it's the other way around. There's one other thing that we need to discuss about polar shifts. They always line up with a consciousness shift. They are interrelated. Thoth lived on Atlantis for a very long time, and he told us that he saw the Earth shift 5 times, watching the sun rise in the east, and then the west, then the east, then the west. This is how to explain why during a consciousness shift at the end of Lemuria, it sank beneath the oceans and Atlantis rose. If the crust was spinning randomly around the planet, many geological events such as continents rising and falling would take place. Now that we have an understanding of polar shifts, we can continue with this drama on Atlantis. 26,000 years ago, we were exactly where we were today on the procession of the equinox. We had gone through our falling asleep phase, and we were about to begin waking up. It was at this point that there was a small consciousness shift. We actually went down in consciousness, not up. A piece of Atlantis about the size of Rhode Island sank into the ocean. This caused a tremendous amount of fear within the Atlanteans, because they thought they were going to lose the whole continent, like what happened with Lemuria. Because of the consciousness shift, one of the bigger things they lost was their connection to the future. They couldn't foresee big events such as the potential sinking of their home. After about 200 years, this fear began to subside. Now, in both the Bible and the Sumerian records, the accounts of Adam, Eve, and all of their children were recorded to have exceptionally long lifespans, like 900 years or so. So 200 years for us back then is like 20 years for us today. We'll explain how we got there soon. Things kind of settled for a while, and then between 13,000 and 16,000 years ago, a comet approached the Earth. Because we were living at a high consciousness across all dimensions, the Atlanteans became aware of it before it hit. A great conflict occurred in Atlantis. The Martians, who were in the minority even though they were in control, wanted to blow it out of the sky with their laser technology. However, the Nacals had learned of the comet's true nature, and the Atlanteans protested. They said that the comet was in divine order. They had to allow it to take place naturally. Let it hit the Earth. That's what's supposed to happen. The Martians fought the Atlanteans, but in the end they gave in. The Martians agreed to let it hit the Earth. When the time arrived, it came screaming into the atmosphere, plunging into the Atlantic Ocean just off to the western shores of Atlantis, near where Charleston, South Carolina is now, only that was at the bottom of the ocean at the time. The remnants of the comet are now scattered across 4 states, and science has definitely determined that it hit at least 12,000 years ago, if not more. They're still finding pieces today. Although the main portion struck near Charleston, a few fragments actually hit the main body of Atlantis, crashing into an area right where the Martians were living, killing a huge portion of their population. They were pissed. They said, "It's all over, we're divorcing you, and we're gonna do whatever we want. You can do what you want, but we will never listen to you again." We know this whole bit. We've seen it in divorced families throughout the world. And the children? Well, look at our modern world today. We are the children. You can guess what the Martians did next. Their primary interface with the reality was control, and when their anger rose to meet their desire for control, they decided to take over the Earth. They began to once again create a complex like the one they built on Mars long ago to try and create another synthetic Merkaba. If they had succeeded, they would have gained control over everything on the planet. The only thing was, around 50,000 Earth years had passed since they had built a Merkaba, and they didn't quite remember how to do it. But they thought they did. The Martians built the buildings in Atlantis. They set up the whole experiment, threw the switch, and lost control. The destruction was immense. In this reality, you can hardly make a greater error than to create an out-of-control Merkaba. The experiment began to rip open the dimensional levels, not the higher ones, but the lower ones. To give an analogy, if you took a knife and slit open your stomach, the stomach acids would seep into other parts of the body that it's not supposed to be in. That's like ripping open the dimensions. The Martians almost destroyed the Earth. The environmental disaster we are experiencing today is nothing in comparison, though today's disasters are a direct result of these events. Because of this tear in the dimensional levels, a huge number of lower dimensional spirits and beings were thrown out of their comfort zone and into these higher levels. They were forced into a world that they did not know or understand. To survive, they needed bodies and began automatically entering into the bodies of people. For every human body, there were hundreds of lower dimensional spirits inhabiting them. These beings were Earthlings like us, but very different, not coming from this dimension. It was a catastrophe, probably the biggest the Earth has ever seen. The reason the Nakals were special wasn't just because of their incredibly high consciousness, making them like guides of Atlantis. They also had achieved what today we call immortality. Let's just say they figured out a way to keep their body healthy and young for as long as they chose, and could choose to pass on whenever they desired it. When reincarnating, they do not suffer the great memory loss that we do when we incarnate. They did it through their expanded consciousness and tantric interdimensional sex meditations. This is how Thoth was a priest king of Atlantis for thousands of years and stayed on Earth until 15 years ago when he gave all of his memories and understanding about sacred geometry to a man named Drunvalo Melchizedek. The Merkaba is formed out of 3 star tetrahedrons overlaid on top of each other. 2 of them are counter-rotating and the third is stationary. When the Merkaba is formed with the unity consciousness, it is formed internally with love. When it is formed externally through the Lucifer experiment, it does not have that love and can become unstable very quickly. The Martians' attempt at controlling the world took place on one of the small islands in the west of Atlantis. This place today is known as the Bermuda Triangle. It's a triangle because the top of the stationary tetrahedron of the Merkaba is actually sticking out of the water there, which causes a huge electromagnetic imbalance in that area. Many planes and boats have reported to have gone missing there. They just vanished without a trace. The imbalance is multidimensional, and in many cases, these ships and planes have been sucked into different dimensions, never to be seen again. That Merkaba is still there on the seafloor today, but from what I know, it's going to be corrected soon. The Nakals did their best to save Atlantis. They sent most of the lower dimensional beings back, at least as many as they could, and sealed up the dimensional tear. Despite this, the situation got really bad, really fast. All of the economic systems collapsed. Financial, social, and all concepts of how life ought to be completely broke down. Everyone on Atlantis began getting sick with weird diseases, and the entire continent went into a state of survival. Life was no longer about living. It became about surviving until tomorrow. It was a literal hell on Earth. The Nakals had no idea what to do. They were children compared to the events that had been thrust upon them. So they prayed. They prayed to the highest levels of conscious life in the universe, asking for help from anyone who could hear them. The problem was reviewed on many high levels of life, who I am drawing as the Justice League because the 11th and 12th dimensions are completely incomprehensible to us in our current state. What they told us was this: we were going to fall. We were going to hit rock bottom, level 1, the lowest place we possibly could be in the universe and still survive. Also, we were changing polarity. We were no longer a female species, so we were starting from square one as a male species. And finally, and this was the shocker, we would only have 13,000 years to return to Christ consciousness. Normally, it takes hundreds of thousands of years for a species to get to Christ consciousness. We had to do it in a fraction of the time. If we didn't, we would not survive. This has never happened before in the universe, ever. Thoth, who was the priest king of Atlantis at the time, learned that they would have to perform this experiment on themselves. They received instructions from the highest levels of life and they went on their way. Thoth proceeded with a being named Ra and Aragat, who were previous kings of Atlantis, and began the experiment. To understand what they did, we have to talk about consciousness grids. A planetary grid is an etheric crystalline structure that envelops the planet and holds the consciousness of any one species of life. This grid does have an electromagnetic component associated with the third dimension, but it also has a component for every dimension as well. These grids are geometric, of course, and science will eventually discover that there is a grid for every species in the world. Each of these grids have their own geometry and are unique. There's not another one like it, just as the species itself are unique. These grids give off light as well, and from space they can be seen as the source of the bluish glow around the Earth. What Thoth and friends had to do was create a synthetic Christ consciousness grid, allowing humans to ascend to Christ consciousness in a very short time. But first, let's talk about the science behind the grid. Perhaps you've heard of the 100th monkey experiment. Over a span of 30 years, scientists were researching a species of monkey called Macaca fuscata on an island in Japan. They were providing the monkeys with sweet potatoes by dropping them in the sand. The monkeys liked sweet potatoes, but they didn't like the sand and dirt so much. A few monkey children figured out that they could wash their sweet potatoes, and some of them taught the technique to their parents. Only a few of the adult monkeys did this though. This went on for some time until one day the monkeys who actually knew the technique hit critical mass. And bingo, the technique started spreading faster than it did before. Monkeys started learning it really easily across all of the Japanese islands nearby as well as on the mainland. They knew that there had to be something that wasn't yet understood about how a species is connected to itself. So what did we do? We tried it on humans. Our research team made a picture out of human faces. About 100 faces hidden within a single picture, but at first glance, you could only see about 6 or 7. They did several surveys with a few hundred people in Australia and said, all right, find the faces. Most people could only pick out 6, 7, 8, 9 or so, not many more. After that, the research team went to Britain and aired the picture on a closed cable BBC special that was shown only in England. They showed where all of the faces were, every last one. Half of the research team, which stayed in Australia, did the experiment again with new subjects. And lo and behold, people were just naturally able to see more faces. After this experiment, they knew that something definitely connects us all, and the field of noetics is learning more about it daily. It's mass consciousness. In lesson 11, I showed you the 3 levels of consciousness. Each of these levels have their own consciousness grids around the planet, and our second level grid is based on squares and triangles. Many governments of the world, especially the Russian and US governments, were studying our grids back in the 60s and probably earlier. When mapping out the grid on the planet, you find little military bases on many of the nodal points of the grid. There are tons of these bases way out in the middle of nowhere, like on little islands like Guam. This couldn't be a coincidence that these government powers placed their bases right where the little spirals came out of the grid. They were trying to take control of the grid, because if you control consciousness, you control what we think and feel. Of course, there was another organization that had its hand in both of these governments, and still do, and we will discuss them soon enough. This grid is visible through astral projection as well. 13,000 years ago, it began. Thoth, Ra, and Aragat were to create a global complex that was able to build a synthetic Christ consciousness grid over a 13,000 year time period. The first thing they did was to fly to a place which is now called the Giza Plateau, but back then it was known as the land of Chem. It was also a rainforest back then as well, not desert like it is today. First, they created a grid around the planet 4th dimensionally, and then began to construct it in the physical 3rd dimension. They went to the male energetic axis of the Earth and constructed a complex which today is called the Solar Cross. These men were 6th dimensional beings at that time and were living at a very high level of consciousness, so whatever they thought happened instantly. It was that simple. According to Thoth, he built the Great Pyramid, not the Egyptian king Cheops. Thoth says that it was built 200 years prior to the pole shift and built very quickly. These pyramids were aligned precisely with both Fibonacci and golden mean spirals emanating from out of the solar cross. Interestingly enough, Edgar Cayce also channeled that the pyramids were constructed in this time. The pyramids were also found to be built from the top down. The stones on top were placed first, which has baffled researchers ever since. Every time more is learned about the pyramids, we move further into dark on understanding how they were formed. If what Thoth says is true, well, that explains everything. From there, Thoth and friends constructed an entire network of temples and structures along this grid 4th dimensionally, placing them on nodes on the new synthetic Christ consciousness grid they were creating. All of them were made with Fibonacci or golden mean spirals, and all of them were mathematically referred back to the solar cross in Egypt through the Great Pyramid. The creation of all of the sacred sites on the planet were no accident. It was a single consciousness that created them all, from Machu Picchu to Stonehenge to Zaghuan, you name it. There are a few exceptions, but most were created by a single awareness as part of a unity consciousness grid. Although the Great Pyramid was done all at once, many of these ancient structures of the world were made 4th dimensionally and slowly dropped in frequency until they manifested on the 3rd dimension over a long period of time. Richard Hoagland's research brings this forward, but he wasn't the first either. They showed how one sacred site is extrapolated from another to another to another. A hot topic of discussion right now are ley lines. These are simply geometric relations between sacred sites. Archaeologists are now finding these huge connections between major spiritual sites in the globe, and now we know why they're connected. These sites had to be built physically so that the Christ consciousness grid could manifest. In a way, think of the physical sites as the wiring of a giant wireless electrical system, and then it needs about 13,000 years of continuous energy flow for it to actually turn on. And just so that you're not left in suspense, yes, the grid was completed. It came to life and is now active, though not really used. Congratulations, Earth, we actually survived. Not only has Thoth told us this in person, but he's also written it down in the Emerald Tablets. These tablets were left in the Great Pyramid thousands of years ago. There are 12 tablets in total, formed from a substance created through alchemical transmutation. They are imperishable, resistant to all elements and corrosion. Their atomic structure is fixed in place, and no change can ever take place. In that respect, they violate the material laws of ionization. These tablets share a great wisdom, and you can read them at over 100 different levels of consciousness, and you will always understand them differently. If you're interested in this stuff, you should definitely consider reading them. As you can probably tell, Thoth plays a pretty large role in what happened, Most of this information comes from him. Thoth also provided most of this information about the flower of life and its geometric relationship to consciousness with us. And this stuff is tied intimately to the geometry of the universe. Considering the quality and quantity of information that he has shared, it makes you really start considering that this next part can be true. The Great Pyramid has a legendary missing capstone. According to the Emerald Tablets, deep under the Great Pyramid there's a room called the Hall of Records. This room was not built by Thoth and long predates the Atlantean civilization. Within the Hall of Records is the capstone of the pyramid, which is 5.5 inches high, solid gold, and completely holographic image of the Great Pyramid. It has all of the little rooms and everything. However, this leaves us with a 24 square foot piece of the Great Pyramid that's missing. If what Thoth says is true, that missing piece actually belongs to a very special airship that exists on Earth. And the way to the airship is through the Sphinx. The Sphinx, according to Thoth, is not 12,000 years old, but dates back over 5.5 million years on Earth. Deep under the Sphinx, about 1 mile down, is a round room with a flat floor and flat ceiling. Inside this room is the oldest synthetic object on Earth. The object is about 2 city blocks in size. It's round like a disc and has a flat bottom and top. It is also only about 3 atoms thick, except for a pattern on the top and bottom which looks like this. This pattern is 5 atoms thick. Thoth says that it's powered by consciousness, thoughts, and feelings, and connects with your own living Merkaba, which means that it becomes an extension of you and your own energy fields. The ship is also intimately connected with the spirit of the Earth, and is the protector for the whole planet. Thoth built the pyramid the way he did to fit with the ship. When on top of the Great Pyramid, it creates this image from above. The disc ship has a circumference equal to the perimeter of the Great Pyramid. As we discussed in lesson 11, whenever that ratio appears, life occurs. This ship can only be used by the purest of souls. See, whenever we approach the point in the procession of the equinox where our poles do these shifts, we become very vulnerable. Things often degenerate, and while things become chaotic, there are often other species who wish to take us over. This has always happened, not just with us, but with all evolving consciousness. Every time a takeover seems imminent, a very pure person will find their way to the ship and raise it into the air. The Earth and Sun will connect with that person and give him or her great power. Then, whatever that person thinks and feels will happen. And think about it. If consciousness is the primary core component of the entire planet, does it not make sense that it would have its own defense mechanism? This defense is an airship that plugs into the Earth and the Sun, allowing the Earth to have protection. Our takeover event actually already happened, the same year the Christ grid was activated. The year was 1989, and we were having some troubles with the Greys, a race of ETs who were slowly plotting takeover due to a previous scuffle we were having. A very pure woman in Peru made the ascension process into the Christ consciousness grid and found the ship. She tuned it to the frequency of the 4th dimension, where she raised it through the Earth and into the air, and manifested a situation for the Greys to leave. Within a very short time, the Greys began getting sick, and remained sick for as long as they stayed here. They have been forced to leave for now, and we are once again safe. The ship is a warship in that whatever race is trying to take over, the person will just think them away, think up a situation, and force them to leave. Returning to the events on Atlantis, after completing the complex in Egypt, Thoth and pals returned to Atlantis, where they waited for about 200 years until that critical point on the procession of the equinox where the poles would shift. They knew that Atlantis would sink, and they would be ready.
Previously on Thoth and Pals.
Thoth, the poles are shifting.
Oh, the pole shift?
Yeah, whoa, what's wrong with your eyes?
I don't know.
When Thoth first saw signs of the polar shift, they returned to the land of Chem and raised the warship into the sky. They went to Atlantis and picked up the Nakals. The Nakals weren't just passengers though, and each and every being was working in unity to create a very powerful Merkaba around themselves and the ship. They returned to the Great Pyramid and landed the ship on top, forming the phi ratio with the pyramid. And then, it happened. The poles began to shift, and human consciousness began to plummet. Simultaneously, the electromagnetic and magnetic fields of the Earth collapsed, and all life on the planet went into the Great Void, the 3.5 days of absolute blackness described by many ancient cultures in the world. The Emerald Tablets say that whenever we go through a polar shift, we go through a void space as we change our frequencies for about 3.5 days. This is also in the Troano document, depicted by 3.5 stones painted black. This refers to a time when we go through what science calls the electromagnetic null zone. During the pole shift, a phenomenon takes place where everything just seems to disappear for a certain time. Usually it's between 2 to 4 days, and the last time it was 3.5 days. Here's where it gets interesting. What happens to us does not usually happen to a normal species, because most advanced species will have their Merkabas handy at the time of the shift. We didn't, due to our little crisis, and we got sucked into the void space without protection. This resulted in us losing our memories. Science realizes that all of our memories are connected through cells in our brains as well as fields around our heads. What is not entirely understood by science yet, at least not directly, is the connection our memories have with the planet itself. We've discussed this before. The magnetics of the Earth affect how we think and act. The Merkaba is an electromagnetic field that you create around your body that can serve as protection from void as you're consciously going through it. What happened to us when we didn't have that protection? It was a clean wipe. When we existed on Atlantis, we were living at a very high level of consciousness in a higher dimension. We had extremely advanced and sophisticated bodies and minds, and were capable of practically anything, living in a dimension where molecules were spaced so far apart that consciousness could interact with them without physically moving. It's hard to explain because you can literally shape your environment immediately through your consciousness in these higher frequencies. In that sense, we were creators, knowing and understanding oneness, beings of love. But then we fell. We dropped back down to this place called the third dimension. We also fell in consciousness back to zero. We forgot how to use the pineal gland, and it slowly shrunk to the size it is now, like a raisin, where it's supposed to be eyeball size. When this happened, we forgot how to breathe source energy into our bodies, and our lifespans went kaput. Eventually, we went from 900 years to what it is today. We had not experienced this dense reality that we had before, at least for a very long time. We were kind of like a supercomputer that gets completely wiped. No operating system or anything. We had these advanced physical bodies, but we didn't know how to use them. This is why today we are so physically advanced compared to pretty much all the other animals in this third dimension. For a time, the survivors of the Atlantean fall, and there were a few, were literally hairy barbarians. We even had to rediscover fire. The reason we're having such a hard time finding evidence of Atlantis is because for the most part, the events of Atlantis took place on a much higher dimension than our physical Earth exists on right now. Everything I've drawn of Atlantis can't be taken as that's what it looked like, because it didn't. This landmass did physically exist, but the Atlanteans were not inhabiting that dimension of its existence. If the warship hadn't been protected by the Merkaba, the Nacals would have lost their memories. They retained their memories when the Earth came out of the void and began their work once more. Thoth and 1/3 of the Nacals went to the Island of the Sun in Bolivia. Aragot and 1/3 went to Tibet, and Ra and the remaining third went to Egypt, where they waited. Now, we're going to begin bridging the gaps between this story and our current history. In between the fall of Atlantis and the dawn of our first civilizations, who were the Egyptians and the Sumerians, there was a 6,500-year gap between them. What was happening to us in that time? We have to look at this procession chart again. This is where we fell in consciousness, point C, and this was our falling asleep phase too. Thoth, Ra, and the Ascended Masters were waiting until point D. They had to wait for humans to just evolve themselves over a 6,500-year time period until they were advanced enough to actually receive this new information that they were going to provide. Sometime in here was when the flood of Noah occurred. Because of the pole shift, the Earth went through an ice age. This is scientific fact. When the ice melted, it would have caused massive flooding. DNA is the physical manifestation of who you are. It is your soul's physical aspect. What we are seeing in DNA is changes in the codons. There's 64 possible codons in DNA, and humans only have about 22 or so. What we're finding is that there are 6 more codons being activated within these children, and they are choosing 2 of the 6. These kids are what we call indigo and crystal children, and probably the super psychics as well. Now, this is a chromosome. Basically, what this is lots and lots of DNA wrapped into this weird H-like shape. This is located in every cell and is part of your body of consciousness. What Thoth tells us is that every level of consciousness seen here not only has its own consciousness grid, but its chromosome change as well. The second level, where we are now, has 44 and 2 chromosomes. To any scientist, this is basic biology. The first level, however, has 42 and 2, and this third level has 46 and 2. The fourth and fifth have 48 and 2 and 50 and 2 respectively. The primary physically visible difference between these DNA in all life is height. The first level has an average height of 4 to 6 feet tall. The second level, us, has an average height of 5 to 7 feet. Third are about 10 to 16 feet, which we are about to translate to. Fourth is 30 to 35 feet, and the last is 50 to 60. You may remember a being named Metatron, the Hebrew archangel who is the perfection of what humanity is to become. He was 55 feet tall, that guy. The last 2 heights are far in the distant future for us, though. This is a place in Egypt today called Abu Simbel. The first thing you notice is that these statues are huge, but with the information about the DNA, this paints a different picture. These beings would be in the 60-foot range if they were to stand. They were at the 5th level of consciousness. These beings on a different wall are 35 feet tall, 4th level of consciousness. Here are some 3rd levels as well. Archaeologists saw this and thought that it meant that the man was just much more important than the woman, when in actuality, the kings of Egypt had 5 different names, one for every level of consciousness. Some of the kings were even able to translate into different dimensions, and that's how they guided the population with the power of the gods. In Egypt, according to today's top archaeologists and researchers, the Egyptians and Sumerians both began their civilizations right around the same time from each other, within a few hundred years or so. Both of these civilizations emerged out of nowhere with perfect writing abilities that were not improved upon since. When they first emerged, they were extremely sophisticated and clear, and slowly degenerated over generations. No archaeologist can explain how this happened or explain how it could have happened. They placed Egypt and Sumer into a special classification called Stairstep evolution. What happened was, one day, Egypt got its language, full and complete. Then the knowledge leveled off. And then it got another massive leap a little while later. Then suddenly, they knew everything about water and moat systems just perfect. Then, a little time later, bam, they're masters of hydraulics. How did Egypt and Sumer do this? Well, this is what Thoth said. When we were evolving on our own for 6,500 years, Ra and the Ascended Masters were waiting in an underground city beneath the Great Pyramid. We'll come back to this in a bit. Thoth's son Tat formed a group called the Tat Brotherhood, which is a secret group that still exists today as protectors and keepers of the sacred temples. Today, they're still connected to the Ascended Masters. So about 6,000 years ago, some members of the Tat Brotherhood would wait until they would meet someone who could understand what they were going to teach them. When they found someone, they would just tune their frequencies to the third dimension and walk up and tell them information flat out. They said, hey, if you do this and this happens. The Egyptians would say, wow, look at that. Then they would go underground, wait another little while, and repeat the process. Over a short period of time, the Egyptian and Sumerian evolution shot up in stair steps. As for the Sumerians, they also received a more detailed story by those who were assisting them. They described to the Sumerians in all of the details they remembered. They said, this is the history of the planet, write it down. The Sumerians knew about the procession of the equinox because they were told it by the Nacals from Atlantis. After this stair-step period, we began to fall asleep further. Things got worse once more. It was our falling sleep stage of procession, and although the Nacals had given us a boost, we were consciously dozing off. On that note, it's time for the story about the city under the pyramid. Keep an open mind about this because there is very little proof for what I'm about to say. For over 40 years, Drunvalo Melchizedek has been studying human consciousness through sacred geometry and spiritual teachers and masters all over the world. In 1996, he was contacted by a source in Egypt who said that something incredible had been discovered. A stone stele came out of the ground between the paws of the Sphinx into the daylight. They removed it and dug into the earth beneath the Sphinx. There they found a room with 3 tunnels leading off of it. One of the tunnels, which went to the Great Pyramid, had another tunnel coming off it, and it was shielded by a wall of light. Bullets could not pass through this field, and people could not even get close to it without feeling like they're going to die. The Egyptian government found a particular person who could turn off this field. They also had brought in Paramount Studios to film it, as they had filmed the opening of King Tut's tomb. They had a good relationship with Egypt. The government wanted several $1 million from Paramount, but at the last minute they asked for an extra $1.5 million under the table. Paramount was outraged and they backed off. Things were silent for about 3 months. Then Drunvalo heard from a source again who was involved in all this, who said that 3 men shut off the light field and went inside. They found themselves inside a very large building that went on for miles underground, which was really the edge of a giant underground city, which was really just one giant building. Then, a little while later, an Egyptian archaeologist named Larry Hunter began describing the same thing, but more detailed. He said that the city was 6.5 by 8 miles wide and 12 stories deep, and the city was outlined by specific temples in Egypt. The 3 pyramids are lined up with Orion's belt, but there are also small temples for every other star in the constellation. Those temples map out the city underground and are made out of a special stone not found anywhere else in Egypt called Koinen stone. Incredibly enough, very recently, ancient tunnels were found in Romania that led to both Egypt and the inner earth. Now, I don't have time to go into detail about this particular story, but if you want, check out the book Transylvanian Sunrise by Radu Sinamar. To be clear, this is a theory that has not been accepted by the Egyptian government, but the underground city that Thoth said was there is, according to Mr. Hunter, marked by temples made of a unique substance, and the temples match the star pattern of the constellation of Orion. 4,000 years after the stair-step evolution, we were at our lowest stage of our evolution. We were hitting bottom on the awareness road. Suddenly, out of the darkness, 3 men came to Earth to give us a little nudge. Everything in ancient Egypt was synthetic. They had this entire civilization based around achieving heightened states of consciousness, but they had to do it through tools. Now, we're not going to look at each of these tools individually, but let me give you a brief overview here. This tool was used for transferring vibrations into the body. Along with that were the hook and flail. This little device was a kind of generator to increase vibrations, though there's not too much information available on it. This thing, however, was their most important tool, the Ankh. They saw the Ankh as the secret to eternal life, and they used it not as a physical tool, but as an energetic one. They would use this form and Ankh their sexual energy. Now, this could be a huge topic on its own, like how energy travels up and down the body through a vertical tube between 5 energy channels that counter-rotate as they extend through the body. But basically, sexual energy is an incredibly powerful energy. We definitely abuse it today, but what the Egyptians knew was that when you had an orgasm, a very large amount of energy bursts from your root chakra all the way up your spine to the top of your head, and then it gets released. What the Egyptians would do was when the spiral of energy hit their heart chakra, they would Ankh the energy out of the back of their body and over their head and back into their body, where they would keep the energy and retain a massive energy boost. In other words, if you take a tuning fork and hit it, it will reverberate for a certain amount of time. Then, if you attach an Ankh on top of it and hit it again, it will reverberate at least 3 times longer. The Egyptians were doing this with their bodies. Moving on, when Atlantis was first formed, the Nacals set up something called a mystery school. This is the special type of school where you learn about consciousness, and you learn different aspects of expanding your own consciousness, and eventually getting to a place where you become immortal. It usually took a very long time to achieve this state, and that's why there were only about 1,000 Nacals in comparison to the millions of Lemurians at the start of Atlantis. The first Atlantean to reach the immortal state was a man named Osiris. Ancient Egypt's mythology tells a story about Osiris, a man who was killed and cut up into pieces by his brother in an act of rage, and then the pieces were scattered. This event, perhaps less exaggerated than the myths, actually did happen, and it took place on Atlantis. Osiris's wife and sister retrieved the pieces, and upon returning the final piece, they restored the creative energy flow and brought his spirit back into the body. Through doing this, Osiris became immortal, and he was the first immortal of Atlantis. This story is told throughout ancient Egypt on many temple walls, and I'm going to show you why. Osiris went through the 3 stages of consciousness. The first one was whole, the second was separated from itself, included physically, and the third was whole again. The Nacals used Osiris's understanding of how he became immortal as a template for how others could do it as well, only through consciousness, without needing to be cut up, of course. This eventually became what we would call the religion of Atlantis, but it was more of a deeper understanding that they were following. This template was also used in Egypt, which we will look at now. Through the stair-step evolution, we began to change from the first level of consciousness into the second. Before the fall, we had incredible memories. It wasn't this vague recollection that we have now, but today we might see it as full-tilt 3D holographic memory. After the fall, we still had a photographic memory, and could share these experiences with each other, which is called dream time. It is what the Aborigines of Australia still have today. Through the introduction of writing, however, we began to change from the first level of consciousness into the second. We lost our incredible memories, and became very separate from each other and ourselves. Thoth was the one who introduced writing, and if you look at ancient Egyptian culture, it even says, Thoth brought writing to us, as well as many other things. Now that we were in the second level, over time, things began to change, and a very serious problem developed, which if it hadn't been solved, it would have caused a major catastrophe in our own near future. Basically, in Egypt, the Ascended Masters had used Osiris's genetic coding of changing chromosomes to show others the path of ascension. They developed a system of 42 and 2 gods, with a lowercase g. They were actually called Neters. Most will recognize this one. His name was Anubis. There were 42 and 2 Neters who were representative of human chromosomes. Each one of them showed a specific pathway of life or human experience, and people would follow these understandings to learn more about their life or their own reality. The problem developed when both Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt became more separated from themselves, and the meanings of these Neters were lost. Over time, the drawings of these Neters changed, and the meanings changed with them. People had no idea what they meant. Then, it got worse, when the Egyptian king Menes merged Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt into a unified country. Menes also merged the belief systems, so now you had 88 gods that people were fighting over to decide who was really God. This was an issue, because now they had people not knowing what to believe, completely lost, separated from their understanding of their own divinity and God. Things became separated further, people fought over which gods were really gods. Today, we look back and say, wow, they thought there were so many gods, when really, this wasn't the case at all. Even with the help from the Tat Brotherhood, we just couldn't get it right. There was one short period of Egyptian culture that most historians don't really understand. As it's written in ancient texts and hieroglyphs, for 17.5 years there was a bizarre new ruler that completely changed how Egypt was run. And his name was Akhenaten. Before him, there were only kings. Akhenaten was the first pharaoh, which meant that which you will become. He was also, believe it or not, 15 to 16 feet tall, at least that's how he was always depicted, and had an elongated skull. Both of these aspects are related to Christ consciousness. Akhenaten abolished all previous understandings of God and tried to instill a one-God understanding in everyone. After 17 years, the majority of Egyptians revolted and Akhenaten was killed, soon to be replaced by someone else, returning to the old system. What actually happened? To correct the problem, Thoth got the help from Ai and Tia, who were the first immortals from Lemuria, and got them to mate interdimensionally to conceive a Christ consciousness being. Thoth said that he worked with the previous kings of Egypt to help achieve this, and Egyptologists find that Akhenaten came completely out of nowhere. It took some time, and there was a transitional period involving Amenhotep III, but soon Akhenaten was on the throne. Akhenaten used his time to bring Egypt back to a simple religion where there was one God, one reality. He used imagery of a sun disk to represent this. The priests in Egypt didn't like that because the religious beliefs were centered on the priests. Then he comes along and says, you don't need priests, God is within you, and you can access God from within your own selves. Well, they didn't like that. He also pulled the military back and said, don't attack unless someone else attacks first. The military didn't like him either. Plus, the people generally didn't like him because they enjoyed worshipping their many gods. Eventually, they disposed of him. After all that, what did Akhenaten do that evidently saved humankind? Well, he developed a mystery school, with the intention of showing a small group of humans a way to ascend into the immortal state. Usually, it took hundreds of years to reach the level of immortality, and Akhenaten had 17 years to produce results. This was a very close call, but he did it. He actually showed 300 individuals the path to immortality in this short time. So after the general population disposed of Akhenaten, these 300 immortals would go beyond Egypt. Thoth wrote in the Emerald Tablets that after ancient Egypt ended, he brought a man named Pythagoras into the Great Pyramid and taught him the geometry of the universe. That man then went on to found Greece, which was originally built upon schools for teaching geometry and the Platonic solids and all of that stuff. Thoth lived a lifetime here as well, where he was known as Hermes Trismegistus. Akhenaten's immortals became a group called the Essene Brotherhood. They first migrated to a place called Masada in Israel. Even today, Masada is known as the capital of the Essene Brotherhood. Now get this. In this brotherhood, there were two people in particular, a man and a woman. You might have heard of them. Mary and Joseph? See, it was part of the Ascended Master's plan that they would bring in a being who would show the pathway to Christ consciousness. He would come to Earth as a second-level being, a regular Joe, and achieve Christ consciousness through the course of his life. Then, the ascension process, the transitional experience from the second to third level, would go into the consciousness grid that was still being formed. He was able to transition because he was originally from these higher levels. That man is known today as Jesus, although his name at that time was Yahshua ben Hur. If Yahshua had not shown up, we would not have had that ascension experience available to us today. None of us would be aware that these higher levels of understanding even existed, and we would destroy ourselves. According to what Thoth said, Mary and Joseph mated interdimensionally. Mary could have been a virgin, physically, but she mated with Joseph in a way that would allow a soul from a higher reality to come down to Earth and have a human experience. Usually, this is impossible to do otherwise. Through Yahshua's work, he came here just like us, a total human being, but he went through these three important stages: final death, resurrection, and ascension, and gave us these experiences so that we could access them down the road. Now, as we all know, the story of Jesus has a missing piece. He was a child, disappeared for some time, and then showed up again when he was 30. In a book called The 18 Absent Years of Jesus Christ, the leading theories about where he went was actually out east to either the Himalayan or Tibetan mountains, where he became an enlightened guru. He brought his teachings back to the world after that. If you remember from part 1, the Kundalini of the planet was residing in Tibet at that time. They were very spiritually adept people living there, and remain so today. Now, on the topic of Christ, there's something else I'd like to bring up: the Lord's Prayer. Today, we know this as the only prayer that Jesus taught, but did you know it's actually a geometric prayer meditation? A man named Bodhi McCoy spent over 20 years working with this prayer and analyzing it with sacred geometry, and has discovered some incredible synchronicities. In his book, Live the Promise, he explains how the original prayer, not the extended version mind you, has 7 segments or thoughts, which align perfectly with the 7 chakras as well as the 7 original branches of yoga. Bodhi teaches how to do this prayer meditation, as well as meditations him and his wife have developed based on the Lord's Prayer, called heart dances. It's really quite incredible to see how it all works with the pure geometries of the universe. If you wish to learn more, check out livethepromise.net. If you study Christian religion and Egyptian religion, you'll actually find that they parallel in almost every way except for the Egyptians' understanding of God. Most evidence shows that Christian religion came out of Egyptian religion, and then later they went back and discredited the Egyptians. Around 300 AD, there was a council called the Council of Nicaea, which was the syndication between the Roman political and religious authorities. Basically, the religious leaders and political leaders realized that they could unite and impose more influence on the people and control society through their unity. It's right around this time that we begin to see the manifestation of the New Testament, which was put together from scriptures and stories, some newer and some much older, which were renewed and superimposed on the life of Yahshua ben Hur, which today we know as Jesus of Nazareth. The term Christ actually stems back from much before the Bible. It comes from the word Christala, which is a word that derives from the original 7 core audible sounds of creation. When the creation of the universe occurred, the original tones were ka, ra, ya, sa, ta, ha, la. Christla actually was broken down on earth into 2 words, Christ, which soon became Christ, and Hla, which became Allah, which were broken down and changed through oral tradition. The symbol for Atlantis was 3 rings inside of the other. The inside were the Nakals, the middle ring were called Maya, and the outer ring were the Atlanteans. The Maya's job was communicating the messages from the inner circle out to the regular people of Atlantis. When Atlantis sank, the Maya took their knowledge, a crystal skull with memories of Atlantis, and their calendar, and went out to what today is called the Yucatan Peninsula, birthplace of the Mayan civilization. Their calendar is the most advanced, detailed calendar on the planet, and it has its roots in Atlantis. Over the last few hundred years, a group of people have slowly monopolized the entire world into what it is now. Today, there are 13 families that are among the richest families in the world. They have their hands in next to every organization and government and control over 95% of the money. They control our modern world from the very tippy top. Today, we like to call them the Illuminati, except that's not really who they are. The word Illuminati means enlightened ones, which was established long ago as a secret society that was focused around expanding knowledge through scientific and spiritual understandings. Secret societies were not originally bad, but rather consisted of those who just kind of got it. They understood information that the average person at that time would not accept and demonize. These societies had to be kept a secret because of the control that the church had and refuted against what they wanted to explore. This is where Freemasonry originally comes from. If you do the research on the time periods, what probably happened was that the church, who had the majority of the control at the time, probably infiltrated some of these organizations to make sure that they were not creating plans to expose information and destroy the world order that they had created. This led to the church exposing some of the societies as devil worship and blasphemous, and fear of these groups rose. Over time, many secret societies branched off by those who were corrupt or previously infiltrated by the church, and gained more control through the church and large organizations that were being established. Today, there exist 13 families around the world who pretty much own the world, with over 95% of the money and a lust for greed, power, and control. More and more information has become present lately that many of these families may have DNA that is different than the rest of the human population. It is speculated that they share DNA that was passed down from the Martian race or other species races. They contain no love or emotion and are completely power-driven. This brings us to the end of the human history story for spirit science, but of course, it's not really the end. For one, we've only really scratched the surface of discussing many of these topics. Secret societies, for example, would take another 2 or 3 lessons to really get into. Plus, the human history story won't end because we're still living it, and what happens next is ultimately up to you. This story, while seemingly unbelievable and at times outrageous, does explain a lot. Think about it. We've covered the Bermuda Triangle, the face on Mars, Jesus, what the Egyptians were doing, the rise of Greece, pretty much most modern religions, the reason we popped up out of nowhere 6,500 years ago, the stair-step evolution of those cultures, and the story of Atlantis, which has been elusive to us at the best of times. It also explains the Great Pyramids and their connection to all of the sacred sites on the planet, the Sumerian tablets, the Emerald tablets, Lucifer, and as for the Hebrews, if you read their Talmud, it actually seems to suggest that they're not from here. I'm not going to tell you to believe it, but it definitely puts some perspective on many questions and aspects about the world which we generally just don't have conclusive answers to. Take it with a grain of salt though. After all, it is just a theory.